Hey guys, tonight we drip beneath the vast Pacific sky, and you're lying there with me on the sand. Warm grains press against your back, the salty air wrapping around you like a blanket. The horizon is endless, and it feels as though the dome of the heavens is sliding down to meet the ocean's edge. Above, stars glitter so thickly that you wonder if someone spilled a box of tiny glass beads across black velvet. The Milky Way stretches like a spilled trail of flour, faint and hazy, but it's enough to remind you that every voyager once relied on those exact pinpricks of light to decide whether they would find land or drift until hunger won. You take a slow breath, as though you're about to step onto a canoe that creaks gently at the shoreline. Imagine the silence. No GPS, no maps, no radio contact. Just you, a wooden hull, and the firm hope that you remember which star is which. You probably wouldn't last a day in that situation. But hey, at least you could tell a good story about being lost at sea. Polynesian navigators, though, turned this impossible test into a skill pass from one generation to the next. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's oddly fun to see the map of our sleepy little community stretch across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The ocean around you is heavy with warmth. Waves roll in, not harshly but like long breaths, rising and falling as if the earth itself is nodding off. You imagine that thousands of years ago, people sat here just as you are, though perhaps less comfortable given the absence of cushioned beach chairs, and tilted their heads skyward to memorize which constellation rose where. For them, stars weren't distant twinkles, they were signposts, tools, sometimes even deities pointing the way. Historians still argue whether Polynesian settlers first reached the farthest islands deliberately or by happy accident, but it's difficult to dismiss the elegance of their star compasses. A mainstream fact. By about 1200 CE, Polynesian voyagers had spread across an ocean covering nearly a third of the Earth's surface, settling places from Hawaii in the north to Aotearoa, New Zealand, in the south, and Easter Island far to the east. It's one of the most astonishing feats of pre-modern exploration. Imagine crossing distances greater than from London to Moscow, all in canoes. No iron compass, no sextant. No, you are here on a glowing screen. Just brain power, muscle, and a sky full of stars. And then there's a quirky tidbit. Sailors often carry a kind of mental map of star houses, memorizing the rising and setting points of constellations along the horizon. It wasn't written down. No neat charts to unfold. Instead, you might chant it, sing it, rehearse it like a poem while staring upward, until Orion's belt became as familiar as your neighbor's laundry line. If you forgot a verse, well, you might also forget where Tahiti was hiding behind the next week of waves. As you breathe in now, imagine the scent of the sea, slightly metallic, tinged with the faint sweetness of algae drying in the sun. Polynesian sailors learned to detect the subtle odors of land from dozens of miles away. The perfume of flowers, the musk of soil, the call of seabirds. You picture yourself sniffing the breeze like a dog, trying to decide whether the neighbor's barbecue is still happening. Ridiculous, yes, but life-saving out there. Of course, not every voyage succeeded. Storms were merciless. Canoes capsized, and sometimes the horizon swallowed explorers whole. But the survival of so many voyages suggests careful method, not mere luck. Think about it. People carried pigs, chickens, dogs, and plants like taro and breadfruit across unimaginable distances, ensuring they had food when they reached land. That wasn't just chance. It was planning at the level of an early space mission. If NASA gave out honorary degrees, Polynesian wayfinders would have shelves full of diplomas. There's still debate among scholars about whether certain islands were discovered once, then forgotten, only to be rediscovered generations later. Did sailors land in Hawaii, return home, and somehow lose a route? Or did the knowledge remain intact through oral tradition, waiting until conditions were right for permanent settlement? These questions float around like driftwood, sometimes bumping into one another, never quite sinking. Tonight, though, you let your mind linger on the sheer beauty of it. Stars rising, stars setting, the dark sea shimmering like a mirror. You trace Cassiopeia's crooked W. You follow the Southern Cross tilting like a compass arrow. The canoes that once cut across these waters are gone, but the techniques remain, stored in chants, songs, and memory palaces etched into culture. You shift slightly in your imagined sand bed, the hush of the waves like a lullaby. Maybe you smile at the thought that somewhere, thousands of years ago, another wanderer just like you tilted their head back, blinked at the overwhelming spread of stars, and muttered, "All right, now which way was Tahiti again?" The canoes wait for you at the edge of the tide, drawn up onto the sand like patient beasts ready to be nudged back into motion. Their wooden hulls glisten with salt spray, fibers lashed tight in careful knots that hold stronger than any nail. You run a hand along the side, and the wood feels both rough and alive, smooth by waves, yet grooved with the memory of the tree it once was. The sails, rolled in tide, lean against the mast like folded wings, and for a moment you imagine the craft itself as dozing before another impossible journey. It's quiet, except for the creak of timber as the canoes shift slightly with the water's pull. That sound, you realize, is a language, but speaking to water, hull answering back. Polynesian voyagers listen to these subtle complaints and sighs as part of their constant awareness. Because on a long voyage, the difference between a safe boat and a failing one could come down to whether you noticed a single crack forming. You hear it now, faint and almost soothing, as though the canoe is clearing its throat. A mainstream fact here. These canoes, known as waka in some islands or wai in Hawaii, were marvels of engineering. Some reached over 20 meters long, capable of carrying not just a small crew but families, animals, and food supplies. The design of the double-hulled canoe gave stability in rough seas, allowing long-distance voyages that astonished early European observers. When Captain Cook first saw one, he noted how fast and graceful it moved, cutting through waves that would have made his sailors queasy. The quirky detail? Polynesian builders sometimes whispered chants to the trees before cutting them, asking permission and guidance. To you, it might sound like singing to a tree, which is the kind of thing your neighbors would definitely notice. But to them, the canoe wasn't just transportation. It was a living extension of the community, carrying souls across the vast and often unfriendly Pacific. You pat the hull now, and it almost feels like it might sigh back. Historians still argue whether these massive vessels were constructed entirely with stone tools, or whether certain islands had early access to bits of metal through drift or trade. Either way, the precision required to carve, lash, and balance them without sawmills or blueprints is enough to make modern engineers tilt their heads in disbelief. You squat down to peek into the belly of one canoe. There's a smell of resin, thick and earthy. Braided ropes are coiled neatly. Gourds hang like hollow rattles ready to carry water, and woven mats line the base for sitting and sleeping. You picture yourself tucked in there, head bumping lightly against the curved ribs of the hull as the ocean breathes beneath you. One cheeky joke slips in. You better hope no one snores too loudly on board. Imagine being trapped for weeks with Uncle Chemo's thunderous nighttime concert echoing across two hulls and a sail. At some point, even the sharks might swim away to get some peace. Standing again, you notice the canoes are set slightly above the high water mark, positioned carefully so the incoming tide will eventually lift them. That means no frantic shoving or straining, just a quiet cooperation of water doing the heavy lifting. Practical, yes, but it also has a touch of patience to it, as if the voyagers trusted the sea to decide exactly when departure should happen. And there's a deeper layer here. Ceremonies often preceded a launch, offerings to gods, blessings from navigators, chants to steady hearts. Voyaging wasn't a casual thing, like deciding to pop to the grocery store. This was high stakes. You, standing in the sand now, feel a hush fall over the group as words ripple through the air. Maybe you don't understand the chant, but the vibration hums in your chest, and you sense that everyone present believes the canoe will listen. Of course, part you is also amused at how much this resembles any modern road trip. Before you set off, someone checks the cooler, someone double-checks directions, someone else insists they pack snacks, but you're not convinced. Here, though, the stakes are infinitely higher. If you forgot to load enough breadfruit, you won't just get hangry. You might not make it back at all. The canoe before you is both ordinary and extraordinary, like a wooden paradox. It creaks, it leaks, it needs endless care. But it also has the potential to cross thousands of kilometers of open water and deliver entire cultures to new shores. You feel your palms resting on the rough beam, and the thought flickers. This isn't just a vehicle. It's a bridge between worlds. The tide laps closer, brushing your ankles. The hull leans slightly, like a horse twitching before a run. Soon, the sailors will step aboard, push out, and trust the stars overhead. For now, though, the canoe waits with you, heavy with history, silently promising that if you're willing to listen, it knows the way. You squint toward the horizon, eyes narrowing against the shimmer of heat rising off the sea. At first, it looks like nothing, just an endless expanse of blue meeting blue. But you blink again and you start to notice subtleties. A cluster of clouds piled like whipped cream in one spot. Faint streaks of white cutting across the water. The lazy arc of a bird soaring farther than you'd expect. The horizon, it turns out, is never truly empty. It's a bulletin board of tiny signals. And if you know how to read them, the Pacific starts whispering directions. A mainstream fact here. Polynesian navigators studied these subtle horizon cues as intently as modern sailors study charts. They learned, for example, that cumulus clouds often form over islands because warm air rises from the land. Spotting such clouds from a distance could mean landfall even when no mountains were visible. Similarly, certain birds, like the knotted tern or the frigate bird, rarely stray far from land. If you saw them flying at dawn or dusk, you could follow their path like commuters heading home after work. Now, here's the quirky tidbit. There are accounts of navigators detecting the reflection of islands in the undersides of clouds. Yes, you heard right. The color of the cloud belly might darken or green slightly if it hovered over a lagoon or dense forest. Imagine lying on your back, pointing at a cloud and confidently announcing, "Yep, that one is a whole island underneath." It sounds like a party trick, but it could mean the difference between surviving or vanishing into empty sea. Historians still argue whether every navigator could consistently pull off this cloud reading or whether only the most skilled had the eye. Was it widespread knowledge, or was it like those few people who claim they can hear the difference between tap water and bottled water? Either way, you tilt your head back now, trying to spot some secret shading under the clouds, and wonder if your eyes are trustworthy enough. The horizon also reveals itself through birds. You watch as a frigate bird circles high above, its wings a sharp V against the sky. Unlike gulls, frigates can't land on water, so they're forced to roost on land at night. Seeing one this far out is a neon sign blinking island ahead. You chuckle quietly, because while you'd be busy trying to interpret Google Maps on your phone with one bar of service, Polynesian voyagers were squinting at birds and confidently plotting new homelands. There's a sensory shift, too. As you breathe deeply, you notice that the air tastes different when land is near. A faint sweetness, almost floral, compared to the flat salt of the open ocean. In your imagination, you stick your tongue out like a weather vane, try and catch the flavor of an island garden hiding beyond the horizon. Sure, it looks ridiculous, but this was part of the tool set. Smell and taste as compass points. A joke sneaks in here. Imagine being on a canoe where the designated navigator suddenly sniffs the air dramatically, closes his eyes, and declares, "I smell bananas, land ho!" At first you'd laugh, but when you actually arrive at an island covered in banana groves, you'd probably start sniffing the air yourself, just in case. You also notice the play of waves at the horizon. In open water, swells move steadily in one direction, but near land, those patterns break and scatter, rebounding off unseen shorelines. Polynesian navigators trained themselves to feel those changes even without seeing them. To you, it might look like nothing more than waves doing their usual messy dance. To them, it was a shifting code, the ocean hinting that something solid was nearby. Another debate among scholars circles around whether voyagers rely primarily on deliberate planning, launching with clear targets, or whether they sometimes used exploratory drift, letting canoes wander until horizon clues revealed new land. Was it strategy or serendipity? The answer probably lies somewhere in between, but you find yourself leaning toward the idea that no one would risk family, food, and future on pure accident. The horizon reading, with all its clouds and birds and scents, feels too practiced to be guesswork. You tilt your gaze lower now, toward the thin line where water meets sky. It shivers faintly, a mirage wavering like heat above asphalt. You realize that staring long enough makes it feel alive, like the horizon is breathing with you. Polynesian voyagers use that living edge as their guide, learning its moods the way you might learn the quirks of a stubborn old car. The squeak that means nothing, the rattle that means pull over immediately. As the waves sigh against the canoe hull, you lean back, letting your eyelids droop. The horizon doesn't shout its secrets. It whispers them. But if you listen closely, if you let your senses stretch, you'll notice that every cloud, every bird, every shimmer is a breadcrumb on a trail across the largest ocean on Earth. And tonight, as you drift on this imaginary voyage, you feel the same quiet thrill. The horizon isn't empty at all. It's a map drawn in sky and sea, waiting for you to follow. You close your eyes for a moment, and the world around you becomes motion, gentle, insistent motion. The canoe rocks under your feet, not violently but rhythmically, like a slow heartbeat echoing through the wood. Beneath you, the Pacific swells rise and fall, some long and lazy, others sharp and insistent. If you pay attention, and you are paying attention now, you realize each wave direction tells its own story. The ocean isn't chaos. It's a woven mat of patterns, and your body is a needle tracing its lines. A mainstream fact. Polynesian navigators studied the swell systems of the Pacific with an almost scientific rigor. They distinguish between primary swells, those driven by prevailing trade winds, and secondary swells, which came from storms hundreds of miles away. Even in the dead of night, when clouds hid the stars, navigators could keep a steady course by aligning their canoe with the invisible push of these waves. The canoe itself became an instrument, rocking in ways that reveal direction. The quirky tidbit? Some wayfinders train by lying flat on their backs in the canoe, eyes closed, letting their bodies memorize how each swell felt. They could sense, for example, when the bow tilted slightly off rhythm or when a cross swell nudged them sideways. You try it now, lying back, arms spread, pretending you can tell whether the canoe is still aligned with the trade winds or being teased by a storm-born ripple from some faraway tempest. Mostly you just feel like you're in a rocking cradle, but for them it was a compass, alive and underfoot. Historians still argue whether these wave-reading skills were innate to everyone on board or reserved for highly trained navigators. Did every sailor sense them, or was it like perfect pitch in music, a gift sharpened only by years of practice? You let the debate wash over you, like one of those crosswells. Present important, but not urgent. What matters is that someone could always feel it, always know. You press your palm to the canoe side. The hull shudders lightly with each impact, and the vibrations climb into your bones. You imagine a navigator leaning quietly against the wood, listening not with ears but with skin. It's strange, isn't it? In your world, navigation often means staring at a glowing rectangle in your hand, ignoring the hum of everything else. Here, it means tuning in so fully that even your skeleton participates. A joke slips in. Picture trying to explain this to your modern GPS. Hey Siri, could you tell me which way the swells are hitting my left rib cage? Even the most advanced AI might throw up its hands at that one. As you continue, the canoe lifts on a particularly tall swell, and then glides down into a trough. The rhythm changes ever so slightly, and you notice that even small shifts matter. A constant east-to-west swell feels like a long rocking chair glide, but the moment a northern pulse joins in, the canoe tilts like a mischievous child tugging at one side. It's playful, almost teasing, and you find yourself smiling as though the ocean is trying to test your awareness. You think of how, over generations, these navigators created mental maps of swells, almost like subway diagrams laid across the sea. Certain routes were remembered not by distance in miles, but by how many nights of steady rocking, until a sharp side push, followed by a double bounce. It sounds vague, but when you're inside it, every sensation etches itself into memory. The sensory details deepen. The salty spray tickling your lips, the sound with groaning, the cool dampness soaking your toes. Every sense is a clue, but the swell is the backbone, steady and continuous even when stars hide and birds vanish. You shift your body slightly, letting the canoe's movement seep into you, and wonder if you could ever learn to trust such subtle information. Another debate among scholars arises. How far could wave piloting alone take a canoe without star guidance? Some argue hundreds of miles, while others suggest it was mostly useful near island groups. There's no tidy answer, only evidence and oral traditions that insist it was possible. You picture the arguments happening in dim university halls, while outside the Pacific rolls on, indifferent, still humming the same rhythms it always has. You feel yourself drifting into that hum, rocking with each crest and dip, each pulse arriving like a whisper from storms too far away to see. The waves are the ocean's language, and right now you are slowly, clumsily learning your first words. You're not fluent, not yet, but you're listening, and for tonight, that feels enough. You tilt your head back and let your gaze climb the night sky. It's dizzying, thousands of pinpoints scattered across a dome, so wide it seems impossible to map. And yet, Polynesian navigators did just that, turning this dizzying canvas into a kind of living compass. You imagine yourself lying flat in a canoe, the mast creaking overhead, your eyes fixed on the stars. Every shimmer becomes a landmark, every rising and setting point a road sign. It feels both overwhelming and strangely soothing, like watching the ceiling of the universe gently rotate. A mainstream fact. Polynesian wayfinders created what we now call the star compass. This was a physical object, but a mental chart in which the horizon was divided into houses, each aligned with the rising and setting points of specific stars. Navigators memorized which star rows were, and by steering the canoe toward that rising point, they could maintain a reliable direction all night. When one star set, they switched to another, like changing from one lane of a highway to the next. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some navigators memorized hundreds of stars through chants and songs, each verse naming a star and its place in the sky. Imagine your bedtime lullaby doubling as your Google Maps. Instead of twinkle, twinkle, you'd be crooning, Altair rises northeast, Vega follows southwest. It might not soothe a baby to sleep, but it would certainly get you to the next island. Historians still argue whether the star compass system was universally uniform across Polynesia or whether each island group had its own version, with local constellations and unique naming systems. The truth probably lies in between, a shared framework with local flavor. For example, one island might see a fishhook in a pattern of stars, while another saw a canoe. Either way, the compass worked because the stars are consistent, even if their stories changed. As you stare, Orion's belt comes into focus, 3 bright dots strung neatly in a line. You remember reading that navigators used such familiar formations as anchors for their memory, but they also relied on lesser-known stars, the quiet ones hiding at the edges. Tonight, those quieter lights feel especially important, like secret companions only revealed to those who bother to stay awake. You also notice how stars rise and set not just anywhere, but along predictable paths. To you, it might just look like cosmic sparkle, but to them, it was clockwork. The Pleiades cluster, for instance, marked seasonal changes, its first appearance before dawn signaling the start of a new year in many island calendars. So not only did stars steer canoes, they set the rhythm of planting, harvesting, and celebration. A joke sneaks in. You can't help but imagine a modern road trip, where the driver insists, "Don't worry, I know where we're going. I memorized the lyrics to a song about the Big Dipper." You probably demand a bathroom break and reconsider your life choices. But here, it worked flawlessly. You feel how the star compass was less about calculation and more about embodiment. A navigator didn't just know the positions intellectually. They felt them. Their eyes swept constantly, checking rising stars against the swells beneath, cross-referencing the song in their head with the rhythm in their body. It was multitasking at a level your smartphone would be jealous of. Debates continue among scholars about how much of this knowledge was formalized versus intuitive. Was it systematically taught? Or did apprentices absorb it through endless nights of practice until the sky itself seemed to rearrange into a familiar grid? Either way, you imagine yourself there, drifting under the immense sky, trying desperately to pin constellations into memory, only to have your eyelids grow heavy. But the stars remain patient teachers. They don't rush, they don't scold. They simply rise and set again and again. And as your canoe glides forward, you find yourself lulled by their constancy. the slow turning of the heavens like a giant lullaby wheel. You're not navigating to any real island tonight. You're navigating towards sleep. The stars, steadfast as ever, promise they'll guide you there, too. You lean your elbows on the side of the canoe and squint into the air, because tonight your teachers are not just stars but wings. Against the pale morning light, a dark speck glides, then another, until you realize the horizon is dotted with birds. To most of us, they'd be background decoration, something you scroll past without a second thought. But to a Polynesian navigator, these were moving arrows pointing the way to survival, a mainstream fact. Certain seabirds rarely travel more than a fixed distance from land. The knotty tern and the brown booby, for example, usually remain within a day's flight of an island. Frigate birds, with their enormous wingspans, can roam farther, but they too must roost ashore by nightfall. Spotting these birds in specific times of day gave navigators crucial clues. Birds heading out at dawn meant they were flying to forage, while those returning at dusk meant land was somewhere in the direction of their flight path. Here's the quirky tidbit. There are accounts of navigators imitating bird calls during voyages, not because they expected replies, but because they believed mimicking the sound kept them alert to changes in bird activity. You imagine someone standing on deck, flapping their arms and calling just to sharpen awareness. To the untrained eye, that looks absurd. To the crew, it was vigilance wrapped in play. Historians still argue whether Polynesian voyagers ever deliberately released captured birds mid-voyage to scout for land. Some oral traditions suggest they carried pet frigates for this purpose, while skeptics point out the impracticality of hauling around annoyed, talon-equipped companions. You imagine yourself holding a grumpy bird in your lap, feathers ruffled and thinking. This is not covered in the owner's manual, yet the bond between voyagers and birds ran deeper than scouting. Bird flight patterns helped establish daily rhythms, gave reassurance when weeks at sea wore down confidence, and sometimes inspired myth. In Hawaiian tradition, certain bird species were considered messengers of the gods, their sudden appearance a sign that ancestors were watching over the voyage. You find that strangely comforting, that in the middle of the most isolated ocean on Earth, a gull could carry the weight of divine approval. As you tilt your head back, you notice how the sky becomes layered with movement. Some birds climb high, others skim low, each with its own distinctive flight line. Navigators memorize these patterns so precisely that they could distinguish species by silhouette alone. It makes you wonder, could you even tell a pigeon from a seagull in low light? You suspect not. But for them, these differences were the breadcrumbs to home. One little joke sneaks in. Picture trying to convince your modern travel buddy to follow a sparrow instead of a GPS app. Don't worry. Man, the bird knows where we're going. The eye roll you get would probably register on seismographs. But out here, centuries ago, that confidence was entirely rational. Birds also hinted at resources. A cluster of them might mean a lagoon rich in fish. Their nesting patterns suggested fresh water nearby. The voyagers learned to notice not just the birds, but what the birds noticed. You lean forward now, tracing their arcs in the sky, and you begin to understand how bird watching, in this context, was less a hobby and more survival strategy. The scholarly debate expands. Were bird patterns alone enough to lead voyagers to remote archipelagos like Hawaii, or were they merely confirmation once other signs pointed the way? Either way, the synergy is undeniable. A navigator's skill wasn't relying on one signal. It was weaving many together. Stars, swells, scents, and yes, wings. The canoe creaks beneath you, steady but small compared to the sky's living map. You feel the shift of air as a bird swoops closer, its shadow sliding across your face for just an instant. It vanishes again, off toward a place you cannot yet see. And in that fleeting moment, you almost believe you could follow across an entire ocean. You inhale slowly, and the air feels different. At first, it's only salt, briny, sharp, unmistakable. But then you notice faint layers tucked within it, almost like hidden notes in a song. There's a trace of damp earth, the sweetness of unseen flowers, and a whisper of green, as if a forest is breathing out across the waves. You realize the ocean isn't just a flat taste. It's a shifting perfume, and Polynesian voyagers tune their senses to it the way you might lean into the smell of coffee brewing in the morning. A mainstream fact. Experienced navigators could detect islands from as far as 20 to 30 miles away simply by the smell carried on trade winds. Volcanic soil, dense vegetation, or blooming plants all left unique signatures in the air. This wasn't guesswork. Accounts from later European sailors even confirmed that certain islands could be identified by scent before they were seen. For example, the sweet smell of pandanus or breadfruit groves often meant landfall was near. Here's the quirky tidbit. Voyagers sometimes describe the smell of distant islands in almost culinary terms. They didn't just say, "I smell land." They might claim that it's the fragrance of roasted taro or the sweetness of banana leaves. You can't help but chuckle, because if you sniff the air and declare, smells like bananas, turn left, your friends would probably stage an intervention. But for them, this sensory poetry doubled as practical data. Historians still argue whether the human nose is consistently reliable across such distances, or whether these reports are exaggerated in oral traditions. Skeptics suggest that the combination of bird patterns and cloud shapes matter more, while optimists point to repeated accounts of navigators literally smelling their way toward safety. The debate floats unresolved, like a fragrant breeze no one can quite pin down. You try it yourself, drawing in another breath. For a moment, you imagine the scent shifting, richer, thicker, as though a hidden island is just beyond sight. Your tongue tingles with the salt, but behind it lingers something softer, almost floral. The illusion is enough to make you crane your neck, scanning for a silhouette against the horizon. Nothing yet, but your body insists. Something is there. This reliance on smell makes sense when you realize how much voyagers trusted their entire bodies to navigate. Their ears caught wave rhythms. Their eyes read stars. Their skin measured currents. And yes, their noses learned to separate the bland sameness of open ocean from the lush breath of land. It's humbling to think of every sense sharpened to such a degree that the world itself became your toolkit. A light joke drifts in. Imagine being the designated sniffer on the crew. Everyone else is busy paddling or adjusting sails, and your official role is to stand at the bow sniffing like a bloodhound. If you sneeze at the wrong moment, you might accidentally point the canoe 100 miles off course. No pressure. Still, the idea sticks with you, that air itself carries a memory of land. The next time you walk into a kitchen and instantly know someone is baking bread, remember that same principle once guided voyagers across an ocean the size of a planet. Scent are invisible threads tying us to places, and Polynesians tug those threads across distances most of us can barely imagine. Another scholarly question lingers. Were some navigators simply more gifted at scent detection, almost like super smellers, or was it training anyone could achieve through practice? No one really knows. What we do know is that Polynesian tradition never separated skill from spirituality. The ability to smell land wasn't just practical. It was often framed as a gift from ancestors, proof that unseen guidance was present. The canoe rocks gently as you take another breath. The air is full of salt, yes, but you swear there's also the faint suggestion of warmth, as if a beach is waiting out there with fires already crackling. You smile at the thought, eyes heavy, nose still twitching. The island isn't visible yet, but in your lungs it's already arrived. Your fingers trace a bundle of sticks lashed together with coconut fiber, the structure delicate yet strangely precise. At first glance, it looks like something a child might build on the sand. Thin rods crisscrossing, shells tied at junctions, an odd lattice of lines. But this is no toy. It's a stick chart, a tool once used by navigators from the Marshall Islands and elsewhere to represent the rhythms of ocean swells and the positions of islands. You hold it gingerly, because it feels fragile enough to snap, yet it carries an entire ocean in its frame. A mainstream fact. These stick charts, known as Reblib or Madon depending on their type, were used as teaching devices rather than carried on voyages. They showed how waves bent around islands, how currents intersected, and where atolls lay scattered across thousands of miles of sea. The sticks represented swell patterns, while shells or knots marked islands. Students memorized them, then left the charts behind, sailing with the knowledge imprinted in their minds. The quirky tidbit? Some stick charts were deliberately abstract, resembling modern art more than maps. Outsiders who saw them often assumed they were nonsense, random sticks tied haphazardly. Yet each curve, each crossing line was intentional. Imagine showing up to geography class and being handed a sculpture that looks like a broken ladder, only to discover it contains more useful information than your entire Google Maps app. That's the level of genius we're talking about. Historians still argue whether stick charts were widespread across Polynesia or a more localized tradition in Micronesia. Some evidence suggests similar mnemonic devices existed elsewhere, but the Marshallese versions remain the most well-documented. The debate reflects a bigger question: how much of navigation was material, and how much was purely oral and embodied? No one agrees, and perhaps that's part of the mystique. You lift the chart toward the light, and the thin sticks cast shadows on your face. They crisscross like phantom waves, and suddenly you feel as though you're gazing at the ocean from above, the swell lines drawn as if by invisible chalk. The shells tied at intersections gleam softly. Tiny pearls of land anchor within the sea of sticks. It's strange. This fragile grid feels sturdier than any paper map, because it's alive with movement. A joke bubbles up. Picture trying to hand one of these charts to a modern sailor. Here's your navigation system. Just memorize this abstract sculpture and you're good to go. You'd probably be thrown overboard for insubordination. Yet here, centuries ago, it worked, and it worked brilliantly. As you tilt the chart, you imagine how students once sat with elders, tracing each line, reciting each swell. The learning wasn't about transferring information onto a physical object, but transferring it into memory, embedding it deep enough that you could recall it while staring at nothing but endless blue. The chart was just scaffolding, soon dismantled, leaving the building of knowledge standing firm in the mind. This, too, sparks debate among scholars. Were these charts literal representations of geography, or were they more like symbolic reminders, aids for oral instruction rather than accurate maps? Some argue the latter, pointing out that no two charts look alike, even when representing the same region. Yet that inconsistency itself suggests a deeper truth. Each navigator's memory was the real chart, personalized and alive. You set the stick chart down, its fragile lattice trembling in the breeze. The canoe creaks, and the waves lap steadily, as though echoing the lines you've just studied. For a moment, you close your eyes, imagining those swells bending and intersecting, your body swaying with their rhythm. The chart fades, but the pattern remains, etched in your senses. And that, after all, was the point. You sit cross-legged in the canoe, the wood warm beneath you, and hear the soft rhythm of voices carried by memory. No parchment, no ink, no compass, just chants. The elders' words echo in your head, weaving stars, swells, and birds into verses that sound like poetry but function as instruction manuals. Each line is a breadcrumb on an invisible path across the Pacific, passed down not in books but in breath. A mainstream fact. Polynesian navigators relied heavily on oral tradition to preserve their knowledge. Apprentices learned through chants that mapped constellations, rising points, and seasonal winds. Entire star lines could be recited like long songs, ensuring the routes between islands weren't forgotten even if the physical map never existed. The chants doubled as calendars, reminding sailors of when certain stars appeared and when it was safe to voyage. The quirky tidbit? Some of these chants weren't solemn recitations, but almost playful rhymes designed to be catchy. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a jingle. You couldn't get it out of your head even if you wanted to. You smile at the idea of an apprentice humming under his breath, accidentally turning navigation into the soundtrack of his daily chores. If today's advertisers have been Polynesian navigators, they have conquered the oceans and sold you a soda while they were at it. Historians still argue whether the oral teachings were standardized across the Polynesian triangle or whether each island group developed distinct variations. Was there one master canon of star chants, or did Hawaiians, Samoans, and Tongans each sing their own versions? Oral tradition is slippery, adapting like water poured into different bowls. That adaptability helped it survive, but leaves scholars debating how unified the system truly was. You lean back, letting the rhythm of an imagined chant roll over you. The words are unfamiliar, yet the cadence is soothing. There's a call and response to it, almost like a lullaby between generations. The elder calling out a star, the apprentice answering with its rising place. You picture a young sailor mumbling through a tricky verse, getting gently corrected, and starting again until the melody of navigation is flawless. The sensory details deepen as you imagine firelight flickering on a sandy shore, an elder pointing skyward while the chant unfurls. The smell of roasting fish drifts nearby. Children doze against their mother's shoulders, and the steady beat of a drum underscores the teaching. Knowledge here isn't sterile. It's wrapped in warmth, community, and rhythm. Learning navigation feels more like participating in a festival than cramming for an exam. One small joke surfaces. You probably fail spectacularly, mixing up verses like a karaoke singer who forgot the lyrics halfway through. Follow Ryan's belt to the chicken coop? The crew would not be impressed. But the apprentices back then couldn't afford mistakes. The cost of a wrong verse was days of hunger, not just embarrassment. Still, you find comfort in the idea that knowledge was sung, not stored. It meant that learning navigation wasn't about isolation with book, but about gathering together, repeating, remembering, laughing at errors, and celebrating mastery. It made the ocean less lonely, because in every chant you carried the voices of your teachers and their teachers before them. As the canoe rocks gently beneath you, you hum under your breath, inventing a nonsense chant just to feel the rhythm. The words don't matter. What matters is the pulse, the repetition, the act of holding memory in sound. Somewhere deep in the Pacific night, those ancient chants still drift, tucked into waves and stars, waiting for you to listen closely enough to hear them. You pace carefully between the twin hulls, the rope bridge beneath your feet swaying with each step. On either side, the ocean rolls out endlessly, a dark blue quilt stitched with silver moonlight. Ahead, the double-hulled canoe stretches long and steady, its balance so natural that you almost forget you're walking on a vessel instead of solid ground. The creaks of wood are soft, almost reassuring, like the canoe itself is breathing with you. A mainstream fact. The double-hulled canoe was one of the greatest maritime innovations of the ancient world. By lashing two hulls together with crossbeams, Polynesian builders created stability far greater than that of a single log or outrigger. This design allowed them to carry more cargo, people, livestock, plants, and to withstand long ocean crossings that would have been impossible in smaller craft. European explorers marveled at their speed and agility, some noting that Polynesian canoes could easily outpace their own ships when conditions favored them. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some double-hulled canoes were built so large they had platforms that functioned almost like floating villages. Families could cook, sleep, and even conduct rituals on board. Imagine a road trip where instead of cramming into a car, you just lash two buses together and set up a small community between them. You wouldn't want to parallel park that contraption, but it would get you across the sea. Historians still argue whether these massive vessels were used primarily for exploration or if many were more domestic, serving as ferries and trading craft between nearby islands. Were the legendary long voyages the norm, or were they exceptional feats? The debate continues, but the physical evidence, canoe remnants, oral tradition, and sheer logic, suggests both were true. Everyday use near home, and daring expeditions when the stars beckoned. As you walk the crossbeam, you feel the bounce beneath your toes. The canoe doesn't resist the waves. It yields and flexes, a harmony between wood and water. You kneel, pressing your palm to the fiber lashings that bind the hulls together. They creak slightly but hold firm, stronger than they look. There's no iron here, no nails, just natural fibers twisted tight. Yet they've endured storms that would have shredded weaker designs. The sensory world sharpens. You smell pitch resin sealing the seams, tangy and smoky. You hear the slap of waves against the hulls, alternating left and right like a heartbeat in stereo. You see the moon casting twin shadows across the deck, elongated and swaying. For a moment, you feel you're straddling two realms. Not just two hulls, but two worlds, land and sea, safety and risk, the known and the unknown. A light joke surfaces. You imagine a sailor stumbling half asleep across the lashings in the dark, tripping and muttering, "Well, at least if I fall, there's another hull to catch me." Not quite the safety net you'd hoped for, but better than a one-way plunge into the ocean. As you steady yourself, you realize how much of this design reflects philosophy as much as engineering. Balance, cooperation, doubling for strength. Two hulls lashed together are stronger than one, just as two people rowing in rhythm can cover more distance than one alone. The canoe itself is a metaphor, a floating sermon on the power of partnership. Debates aside, you can't help but admire the quiet genius of it. Here you are, pacing above a design conceived centuries ago, and it feels both ancient and futuristic. You wouldn't be surprised if tomorrow's engineers stole the concept back for some sleek new eco-ship. After all, what is innovation if not rediscovery? You pause midway across the beam, swaying with the sea. The canoe rocks, but you don't stumble. The balance holds, steady and strong, carrying you forward into the night. Somewhere out there lies land, but here, between the twin hulls, you already feel a home. You dip your hand into the sea and let the water slide through your fingers. It tastes of salt, yes, but if you pay attention, really pay attention, you notice the flavor changes. Some currents bring a sharper sting, almost metallic, while others are softer, as if diluted by fresh streams running into the ocean from hidden land. You imagine licking the ocean like a giant soup, and, strangely enough, that's exactly what Polynesian navigators did. They tasted their way through the Pacific, a mainstream fact. Experienced wayfinders could detect changes in salinity, temperature, and even water color to help confirm their location. Near atolls, the water often turned a paler turquoise, while volcanic islands darkened the sea with mineral-rich outflows. Shifts in taste and color were cues that land was near, or that current had pulled the canoe closer to or farther from a target. These signs were subtle, but combined with stars and swells, they created a layered navigation system. The quirky tidbit? Some oral accounts suggest navigators literally sipped seawater at intervals during a voyage, comparing its taste to their memory of different routes. Picture yourself at sea, lifting a shell of briny liquid to your lips like a sommelier, muttering, Yes, notes of basalt and pandanus, definitely heading toward Tahiti. It's absurd and brilliant at the same time. Historians still argue whether these reports are exaggerations or whether sailors truly relied on taste as a navigational method. Skeptics point out the difficulty of distinguishing such subtle differences in open water. Supporters counter that with years of training, even small sensory cues can become reliable. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Taste alone wouldn't guide you, but combined with smell, sight, and sound, it added another thread to the web of awareness. You lean over the edge of the canoe, watching the water shift in color as moonlight paints it. At certain angles, it's black glass, at others a pale gray ripple. Beneath the surface, plankton glow faintly, little sparks of life flashing as your fingers trail through. The ocean is never uniform. It's a shifting mosaic, and your senses are the brushes that paint meaning onto it. A joke flickers in your mind. Imagine telling your travel companions, "Don't worry, I know where we are, I just licked the Pacific and it tastes like Fiji." You lose all credibility immediately. But for voyagers, credibility came not from gadgets, but from a reputation for arriving alive. If you reached land, your odd little tasting ritual was instantly justified. The practice of noticing water extended beyond taste. Navigators studied the patterns of floating debris. Bits of seaweed, driftwood, even pumice stone from distant volcanic eruptions. A sudden change in the kind of debris suggested proximity to a different island group. You imagine leaning over and spotting a palm frond bobbing past, green and fresh enough that it must have come from land not far away. It's like receiving a secret postcard from the island before you even see it. Another scholarly debate circles here. Was this sensory reading systematic, taught formally, or was it more anecdotal, passed as tips from elder to apprentice? The lack of written records leaves the question open, but the sheer consistency of reports across regions suggests it was deliberate training. The ocean was a classroom, and every wave a lesson. You sit back now, lips tingling faintly from the salt water you pretended to taste, and you realize how immersive the system was. No single sense carried the responsibility. Eyes read stars, ears caught swells, skin felt vibrations, nose sniffed land, and tongue confirmed shifts in current. It's humbling, isn't it? To think of human beings using the full orchestra of their senses to cross one of the largest oceans in the world. The canoe rocks gently, as if agreeing with your thoughts. You feel smaller than ever, but also oddly capable, as though you too could learn to taste your way across the Pacific. If only you had enough time and patience. For now, though, You simply let the salt linger on your lips, a reminder that the ocean has flavors, and that each one once pointed the way home. You lean against the mast and glance at the bundles stored neatly at your feet. Woven mats, gourds filled with water, baskets tied tight with pandanus leaves. Inside, there are breadfruit, taro, coconuts, salted fish, and dried bananas, the provisions that kept voyagers alive for weeks or months at sea. The canoe smells faintly of smoke and fermentation, a pantry afloat on an endless expanse of blue. Out here, food isn't just sustenance. It's survival, memory, and comfort all rolled into one. A mainstream fact. Polynesian voyagers carried carefully prepared staples like breadfruit paste, called masi in some places, that could last months without spoiling. They also relied on taro, yams, and coconuts, plants that not only fed people but could be transplanted to new islands, ensuring future harvests. Fish was caught along the way, sometimes with ingenious lures shaped from bone and shell that shimmered like real prey. Chickens, pigs, and dogs were also transported, turning each canoe into a miniature ark. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some canoes included portable earth ovens, stone-lined pits where food could be slow-cooked even on the open sea. Picture that. You're thousands of miles from home, waves rocking the canoe, and someone is calmly steaming breadfruit in a little oven as though it's Sunday dinner. You almost laugh at the image, but it makes sense. Warm food lifted morale and reminded sailors of the life waiting on shore. Historians still argue whether these provisions were usually sufficient for long voyages, or whether voyagers depended more on foraging and fishing along the way. Did they set off with months of food stockpiled? Or did they trust the ocean provide? Evidence suggests a balance. Enough packed food to ensure survival, but an expectation that fresh catches would supplement supplies. The debate lingers because oral traditions emphasize both careful planning and daring trust. You open one of the baskets in your mind and smell the salted fish, sharp, briny, and comforting. Your stomach growls, even though you know it's only pretend. You crack an imaginary coconut, sip the sweet water, and feel how it refreshes more than plain water ever could. Coconut wasn't just hydration. Its shell became a bowl, its husk became rope or fuel. It was a Swiss Army knife of the Pacific, versatile and indispensable. One light joke surfaces. Imagine trying to explain coconut's importance to someone who only knows it as a fancy latte flavor. No, Karen, it's not just for your trendy iced coffee. It literally kept civilizations alive. You also notice how the act of sharing food bonded the crew. Eating together was a ritual, a reassurance that they weren't just drifting bodies but a community afloat. Apprentices learned not only star chants, but also how to prepare food for a group, because leadership meant keeping everyone nourished in body, as well as in spirit. And you can't help but marvel at how much forethought went into choosing what to bring. These were not reckless gamblers tossing dice against the waves. They were careful logisticians, planners who knew exactly how many taro roots to pack for a given route. The image of voyagers as lucky drifters collapses when you realize they managed inventory like seasoned quartermasters. Another debate among scholars rises here. Were animals always brought for breeding on new islands, or were they sometimes carried only as emergency food? Archaeological evidence shows pigs and chickens became established across Polynesia, but the purpose of each voyage remains uncertain. Either way, the animals were precious cargo. Life multiplying into more life across distant shores. The canoe creaks softly as you imagine yourself sharing a meal with the crew. Someone passes you a piece of dried banana, chewy and sweet, while another ladles taro stew into a coconut shell. For a moment, the sea fades, and it feels like a family dinner under the stars. Food wasn't just fuel. It was a promise that life would continue, no matter how wide the ocean stretched. The sky darkens, and you feel the wind shift, heavier, moister, laced with an uneasy coolness. The swell beneath the canoe grows irregular, no longer the steady rhythm you've grown used to, but a restless shoving from all sides. Polynesian voyagers knew this feeling well. The warning signs of a storm. You brace your body instinctively, gripping the lashings, as though the ancient wisdom stored in your bones is whispering, "Steady yourself, it's coming." A mainstream fact. Pacific storms were both dreaded and studied. Navigators recognized cloud formations that foretold cyclones, watched for sudden drops in barometric pressure, though they wouldn't have called it that. and memorized safe harbors along routes where they could wait out tempests. Oral traditions taught which islands had protective reefs, which lagoons offered calm water, and which channels would tear a canoe apart if entered in panic. The quirky tidbit? Some voyagers carried charms or talismans said to calm storms. These could be small carved figures, shells, or bundles of feathers blessed by priests. Whether they worked is debatable, but imagine being in the middle of a squall, lightning cracking overhead, and clutching your lucky seashell for dear life. You can't help but smile. Superstition and science often shared the same canoe. Historians still argue whether storm navigation was primarily skill or luck. Was survival the result of precise seamanship, knowing when to drop sails, when to ride the waves diagonally, or was it mostly fortune favoring the prepared? Accounts suggest both. Skill kept you alive longer, but chance decided whether the storm relented or swallowed you whole. The debate continues, just as the storms themselves always have. The sensory details sharpen. You hear thunder grumble low, rolling across the water like a giant clearing its throat. Lightning flickers, not yet close, but close enough to paint the horizon in ghostly white. The smell of rain arrives before the drops do, earthy and metallic, and when the first sheet falls, it's warm, heavy, and relentless. The canoe tilts, lashes creaking under strain, and water slaps over the hull, cold against your legs. In this chaos, the crew doesn't panic, they act. Sails are reefed, ropes tightened, buckets pass the bale water. You watch their movements and realize storms weren't just obstacles. They were teachers. Every storm that didn't destroy you made you sharper, more aware, more respectful of the sea's moods. A joke floats into your mind, perhaps as a survival mechanism. Imagine if storms had Yelp reviews. This cyclone, 2 stars. Too loud, too wet, no complimentary snacks. Would not recommend. The absurdity makes you chuckle, even as your grip tightens on the hull. Through the sheets of rain, you notice how the ocean itself changes color, turning from black to a strange phosphorescent gray as foam explodes against waves. Navigators learn to read these shifts, steering toward areas where waves broke more evenly, away from dangerous cross-currents. To you, it looks like chaos. To them, it was patterned chaos, decipherable with enough patience. Another scholarly question surfaces. Did voyagers deliberately set sail during storm seasons to test their resilience, or did they avoid them whenever possible? Evidence leans toward caution, but stories of legendary navigators sometimes describe deliberate risk-taking, framing storms as trials of character as much as skill. It's hard to know where history ends and myth begins. You sit soaked, shivering slightly, but strangely calm. The storm doesn't feel like an enemy. It feels like a rite of passage. Polynesian sailors survived not by resisting, but by flexing, letting the canoe move with the waves, loosening control while still guiding the direction. You feel that philosophy seep into your own bones. Sometimes life is a storm, and the trick is not to fight every wave, but to ride them until the sky clears. And eventually it does. The thunder drifts, the lightning fades, the rain softens to a drizzle. You blink at the sudden stars reappearing, brilliant and sharp, as if the heavens have rinsed themselves clean. The storm has passed, leaving you tired but alive, and the canoe sighs with you, grateful to float onward once more. The clouds have thinned, and the sky reveals a softer lantern. The moon, it hangs low, pale and round, tossing silver across the waves. You tilt your head, and the canoe rocks with you, as though it too is looking upward. For Polynesian navigators, the moon was not just a gentle nightlight. It was a clock, a calendar, and sometimes even a compass. Its tilt, its rise, its cycles carried lessons as old as the ocean itself. A mainstream fact. Lunar phases were crucial in Polynesian navigation and daily life. Farmers and fishers timed planting, harvesting, and fishing according to the moon's waxing and waning. At sea, voyagers used the moon's position to check bearings when clouds obscured the stars. Its cycle also helped mark time, each night linked to a specific name, and each name carrying associations with tides, winds, and success in travel. Here's the quirky tidbit. On some islands, the tilt of the crescent moon was compared to a canoe itself. If the tips of the crescent pointed upward like a bowl, it was said to hold water, promising rain. If it tilted downward, it poured out, signaling drier weather. You grin at the thought. Nature's own weather app, no Wi-Fi required. Imagine checking your forecast not on your phone, but by squinting at the moon and muttering, "Yep, the canoe's upside down, better pack an umbrella." Historians still argue whether navigators used the moon systematically as a directional tool or if it was more of a supplementary guide, filling in when stars were hidden. Some scholars insist lunar observation was precise enough to plot courses, while others argue its shifting path across the sky made it unreliable on its own. The truth likely lies in combination. The moon wasn't the sole compass, but added layers to a navigator's mental toolkit. You notice how the moonlight transforms the sea around you. Each wave crest flashes silver, a flickering mosaic that makes the ocean look alive, breathing with liquid light. You can almost trace paths along its reflections, as though the moon is sketching a road just for you. The canoe glides more smoothly now, calmer after the storm, and you realize how the rhythm of night sky and water interweave into a single language. You think of how the lunar cycle governs sleep. 2. Voyagers often align their rest with the darker nights, when the new moon left the sky pitch black, making navigation trickier. On bright nights, though, more sailing could be done because the horizon stayed visible. Imagine your entire circadian rhythm bending not to alarm clocks but to a glowing orb above your head. A joke sneaks in. If you live by the moon today, half your excuses for being late would sound absurd. Sorry I missed work, or I wasn't lined up yet, and the moon canoe was tilted the wrong way. But centuries ago, that logic held the weight of survival. The canoe creaks softly beneath you, and you feel the moon's pull mirrored in the tide lapping against the hull. You lick your lips and swear the water tastes faintly different tonight, as though even salinity bends the lunar cycles. It's no wonder voyagers wove moon lore into their chants. How else to carry such a slippery teacher across generations? Another scholarly debate rises here. Did the moon serve more as a cultural anchor, tying voyages to rituals and myths, or as a practical backup navigation tool? Likely it was both. To Polynesian wayfinders, practicality and spirituality were inseparable. The moon wasn't just a glowing ball in the sky. It was a companion, a silent witness to every stroke of the paddle. You lean back now, the salt still sticky on your skin, and let the moonlight bathe your face. Its glow is softer than the stars, more forgiving, almost maternal. It doesn't demand precision like a star compass. It simply reminds you that time passes, tides shift, and the journey flows on. For tonight, that reassurance is enough. You let your eyes wander across the horizon, and a story drifts into your thoughts. The kind sailors told when the sea grew too quiet and the stars too bright. These are the drift stories, tales of crews blown far off course, vanishing into weeks of uncertainty, only to stumble back with improbable news of new lands. They were cautionary tales, but also seeds of possibility, because sometimes being lost was how discovery began. A mainstream fact. Oral traditions across Polynesia describe accidental voyages, canoes caught in storms or swept by currents, landing on distant islands they had not aimed for. Modern scholars believe such events did occur, and some islands may have been settled initially by chance before deliberate navigation routes were established. Archaeological evidence, like shared crops and tools, hints at both intentional exploration and serendipitous arrival. The quirky tidbit? Some drift stories grew so embellished that they included elements like canoes carried by giant sea turtles, or sailors returning decades later with impossibly long beards and new families from the islands where they'd been stranded. You grin at the image, a weathered uncle staggering back into the village muttering, "Yeah, I just took the scenic route." It's both tragic and funny, the kind of tale retold with equal parts fear and amusement. Historians still argue how much weight to give these stories. Were they primarily myth, meant to dramatize the dangers of careless voyaging? Or were they half-remembered records of real events, passed down with creative exaggeration? The debates circle endlessly, much like the currents that inspired them. What's clear is that the Pacific kept no secrets forever. Drift or design, people kept arriving on distant shores. You picture yourself in such a situation. The stars are hidden by cloud, the swells confused, and the canoe drifts at the mercy of unseen forces. Days stretch, supplies dwindle, and your only companions are the steady creak of wood. and the gulls overhead. Fear gnaws at you, but then one morning, you smell pandanus on the wind. By evening, an island's outline rises from the haze, and survival suddenly transforms into discovery. The sensory details intensify. The taste of stale water, the itch of salt crusting on your skin, the emptiness of the horizon when you've seen the same nothing for weeks. The relief of spotting land after drifting blindly must have been overwhelming, like stumbling into light after being lost underground. You feel your chest loosen just imagining it. A joke surfaces. In a way, drift voyages were the original wrong turn on a road trip. Except instead of ending up in the next town over, you might land 1,000 miles away, inventing a new branch of your culture by accident. Talk about taking the scenic route. Drift stories also served as warnings. They reminded apprentices that arrogance had no place on the ocean. You might think you're in control, but one rogue storm or current could make you humble fast. Yet at the same time, these stories carried wonder. Without drift, perhaps fewer islands would have been settled. The Pacific is both punisher and gift-giver, scattering people like seeds and then letting them root in new soil. Another scholarly debate lingers. Did these drift voyages contribute more to cultural exchange or to permanent settlement? Some argue they seeded knowledge of distant lands without immediate colonization, while others claim whole communities began from a single lost canoe. The evidence is patchy, but the oral traditions keep the possibility alive. You shift in your seat, listening to the water slap the hull, and you realize how much a human history balances between intention and accident. Voyagers set out with plans, yes, but sometimes the greatest discoveries came from being lost. And maybe that's a quiet lesson of these stories, that even drifting, even wandering without a map, you might still find your way home, or to a new home you never knew was waiting. You picture yourself younger, standing barefoot on a shore, while the elders decide whether you're ready. The night is thick with stars, but you're not allowed to look away. Your teacher points to Orion's belt, then to a swell line, then back to the horizon. The test has begun. Navigators were not born. They were trained, molded through endless nights of memorization and practice, until the ocean itself felt like part of their body. A mainstream fact. Apprentices in Polynesian navigation underwent years of training under master wayfinders. They memorized star paths, seasonal wind shifts, and the behavior of birds and clouds. The teaching wasn't just academic. It was experiential. Students had to spend nights lying flat on the canoe, eyes open, learning to feel the roll of swells, or sit through hours of chants until every verse was etched into memory. The quirky tidbit? In some places, apprentices were deliberately deprived of sight for short periods during training. They were blindfolded so they would sharpen other senses, ears to hear wave rhythms, skin to feel shifts in current. You grin at the image of a line of young sailors stumbling around with cloths tied over their eyes, looking like they're practicing for a very wet game of hide-and-seek. But the result was deadly serious. A navigator had to see, even in darkness. Historians still argue whether training was formalized into specific schools across Polynesia or whether it was more ad hoc, depending on families and local traditions. Some sources describe structured institutions where knowledge was guarded closely, while others suggest informal mentoring by elders. Either way, the apprenticeship was rigorous, a long filtering process to ensure only the most capable earned the role of navigator. You feel the weight of that role pressing on your shoulders as you imagine yourself being tested. Your teacher asks you to point to the star that will rise next in the east, and you hesitate. A flicker of doubt, a pause too long, and you know you'll be sent back to practice. It's humbling. This realization that mastery wasn't about memorizing a few constellations, but internalizing an entire ocean's worth of data. The sensory details deepen. Your bare feet sink into damp sand as the tide laps, cool and insistent. You smell the smoke of a torch carried by your teacher, its resin scent mixing with the salt air. Your ears strain to hear his voice over the crash of waves, every word heavy with consequence. It's not a school exam. You're not worried about grades. You're worried about whether you'll ever be trusted to carry people's lives across the sea. A light joke slips in. Imagine being told in modern times, "Congratulations, you passed your test." Your reward is responsibility for 50 lives and 3 pigs on a canoe across 2,000 miles. Don't mess it up. You'd probably run back to algebra class and never complain again. The apprentices' training wasn't just technical, it was spiritual. They were taught to respect the ocean as a living entity, to treat the stars as ancestors watching over them. Knowledge was sacred, not simply useful. The chants weren't recited like dry lists. They were performed like prayers, anchoring each lesson in reverence. Another scholarly debate appears here. Were only men trained as navigators, or did women sometimes learn these arts? Some oral traditions hint at female wayfinders, though the majority of records emphasize men. The truth is hazy, hidden by centuries of shifting cultural roles, but the possibility lingers like an uncharted island on the horizon. You close your eyes now, pretending you're that apprentice again. The waves push against your calves, steady and rhythmic. Your teacher's voice asks you to recall the star that marks north. You breathe, you point, and this time you get it right. A murmur of approval, soft but genuine, and you feel pride bloom in your chest. The ocean is vast, the stars countless, but piece by piece, you're learning to carry them within you. The canoe drifts under the stars, and you notice how the crew's eyes linger on one person, the navigator. Not just a sailor, not just a leader, but someone treated with the weight of ceremony. The navigator sits quietly, not shouting orders, but his presence radiates authority. It's more than skill, it's sacred. You realize that in Polynesian culture, the role of wayfinder often hovered close to that of a priest, bridging the practical and the divine. A mainstream fact. Navigators were highly respected figures across Polynesia, often granted privileges similar to chiefs or spiritual leaders. Their knowledge of routes, currents, and skies was considered a sacred trust. Without them, voyages were impossible, so their authority extended beyond the canoe, shaping decisions about when to travel, which islands to settle, and how to preserve traditions. The quirky tidbit? In some communities, navigators weren't allowed to do ordinary tasks like fishing or paddling during a voyage. Their focus had to remain entirely on navigation, watching the sky, feeling the swells, smelling the wind. Imagine getting a free pass from chores because your job was just think really hard. You almost laugh, picturing other crew members rolling their eyes while sweating over paddles. But in truth, the navigator carried the heavier burden, the lives of everyone on board. Historians still argue how much of the sacred role was spiritual versus practical. Were navigators elevated because of their measurable skill, or because cultures wrapped their talent in ritual to protect it from being forgotten? Some suggest the sacredness made the knowledge harder to dilute or misuse, ensuring continuity. Others argue it was about power. Navigators became indispensable, so reverence protected their status. The debate mirrors the dual nature of their work, part science, part faith. You close your eyes and imagine what it felt like to bear that responsibility. Every cloud shape, every bird cry, every flicker of a star was a message meant only for you. The crew looked at you not for entertainment or comfort, but for survival. Your word was law, because your word determined whether anyone saw land again. The sensory world sharpens. The navigator sits cross-legged near the mast, his skin glistening in moonlight, his eyes never still. He barely speaks, but the silence around him feels charged, as though even the sea holds its breath to listen. A faint smell of kava root drifts through the air from a ritual earlier in the evening, grounding the moment in both body and spirit. A light joke slips in. Imagine if modern airline pilots were treated this way. Instead of safety briefings, passengers would bow reverently and whisper, "May the Great Keeper GPS guide us safely to Los Angeles." You chuckle at the thought, but then realize maybe we've lost something in forgetting how sacred travel once felt. This reverence also meant knowledge wasn't freely shared. Apprentices had to prove not only skill, but also moral worthiness before receiving teachings. Navigation was a mantle, not a hobby. It carried the weight of ancestors, gods, and future generations. That aura of holiness protected the knowledge, ensuring it wasn't diluted by careless hands. Another scholarly debate surfaces. Was the sacred treatment of navigators universal across all Polynesian cultures, or did it vary island to island? Records are mixed, and colonial disruption erased much evidence. What remains is the sense that wherever they sailed, navigators were never ordinary. They were always something more. You breathe slowly, feeling the quiet gravity of that roll. The waves lap against the hull. Stars blink patiently overhead, and the crew moves about their duties. But in the center sits a navigator, silent, revered, both human and something slightly beyond. You find yourself bowing inwardly, too, honoring the invisible thread of wisdom that stitched together islands across a vast and restless sea. The canoe rocks softly, and as you glance around the crew, you notice not just men, but the quiet presence of women, though history books often skim past them. Some are tending food bundles, others steadying children, and a few lift their faces to the stars with the same sharp gaze as any navigator. Their role on these voyages may not always have been celebrated, but whispers and oral tradition suggest they were there, shaping the story in ways often forgotten. A mainstream fact. Women participated in Polynesian voyaging, both as passengers and in some accounts as skilled navigators. Archaeological evidence shows women were among the first settlers of islands like Hawaii and Aotearoa, because successful colonization required entire families, not just crews of men. Their presence meant continuity, new life, new gardens, and new communities planted on distant shores. The quirky tidbit? Some chants describe women with uncanny directional sense, credited with dreams that revealed the right star to follow or the moment to tack the sails. It blurs the line between intuition and navigation, but also hints that women held knowledge as vital as men's. Imagine a modern sailing trip where your aunt insists she just has a feeling about which way to turn, and she turns out to be right every time. You'd laugh, but also never bet against her again. Historians still argue whether women regularly served as wayfinders in their own right, or whether their contributions were more subtle, hidden under layers of myth and gendered storytelling. Some scholars believe female navigators existed, but were later erased by patriarchal retellings. Others suggest their influence came in dreams, rituals, or counsel before voyages began. The truth lingers in fragments, like distant stars partly obscured by clouds. You close your eyes and imagine one such woman aboard, sitting at the canoe's edge. The moonlight outlines her hair, the spray dampens her arms, and her eyes fix on a cluster of stars with steady confidence. Around her, men whisper, but she says nothing, her presence itself a compass, her silence commanding respect. The smell of pandanus mats drying underfoot blends with the tang of salt on her skin. A joke bubbles up. Picture the scene where the male navigator makes a long speech about swell patterns and cloud reflections, only for the woman beside him to shrug and say, "Yeah, land that way," pointing casually. And of course, she's right. You can almost hear the awkward coughs and the collective, "well then." The sensory world sharpens. A child stirs in sleep on the deck, a reminder that voyages weren't just conquest of geography, but acts of family, of future. The laughter of women soothed fear. Their songs carried rhythm to paddle strokes, and their hands kept food and children alive when storms raged. Without them, settlement would have been impossible. Another scholarly debate. When migration stretched farthest, were women deliberately included to ensure survival, or did some voyages start male only with women arriving later? Archaeology suggests whole communities sometimes travel together, but oral histories are inconsistent. Still, the evidence of female presence is undeniable, even if historians keep wrangling over the details. You sit back and let the image linger. Women aboard, eyes scanning stars, hands steady on the canoe, voices blending with men's in chants to guide the way. Their role may be softened or obscured, but it remains carved into the story of the Pacific. Tonight, in the hush of waves and starlight, you honor them too, invisible yet essential, carrying futures across waters vast enough to swallow any single name, but not an entire people. The night deepens, and your thoughts drift toward stories older than any chart or chant, the myths that threaded meaning into the act of voyaging. For Polynesians, navigation wasn't just skill. It was woven into tales of gods and demigods, their exploits explaining why islands rose from the sea, or why certain stars gleam brighter than others. You tilt your head back and imagine one such figure. Maui, the trickster, pulling new land from the ocean with his magical fishhook. A mainstream fact. Throughout Polynesia, Maui is a central culture hero whose adventures explain natural phenomena. In Hawaii, he snared the sun to slow its journey, lengthening the day. In other traditions, he lifted the sky higher, so people could move freely. And most famously, he cast his fishhook into the deep Pacific and hauled up islands, giving people new places to live. These myths didn't just entertain. They reinforced the idea that exploration and creation were sacred acts. The quirky tidbit? Some legends describe Maui's hook as being made from his grandmother's jawbone. You can't help but smile at that detail. Imagine explaining to your family that you borrowed grandma's bones to go fishing and accidentally pulled up an archipelago. It's equal parts morbid and ingenious, and it makes the story stick in your mind like no ordinary tool could. Historians still argue how much these myths influenced real voyages. Were sailors inspired by Maui's example pushed farther into the unknown, framing exploration as divine imitation? Or were the myths created afterward, retroactively explaining the human daring that had already taken place? The line between myth and memory blurs, like stars shimmering through a haze of cloud. The sensory world sharpens as you imagine the myth unfolding. You hear the groan of a rope tightening, the slap of water as something massive stirs below. The smell of brine thickens, as though the ocean itself resists being reshaped. The canoe tilts as Maui pulls, in your mind's eye, jagged peaks emerge, dripping and steaming, new islands dragged up from darkness into light. A playful joke slips in. Picture being on Maui's crew during that stunt. Hey, boss, what are we fishing for today? Oh, just, another continent. You probably wish you had packed more snacks. But beneath the humor, you feel the gravity of it. Myths like these weren't just bedtime stories. They were cultural GPS, affirming that seeking new horizons was part of humanity's pact with the gods. If Maui could haul islands from the sea, then human voyagers could surely find the ones already waiting. Another scholarly debate arises. Do these myths preserve faint echoes of real migrations, or are they purely symbolic? Some anthropologists argue that Maui's hooking islands reflects collective memory of discovering new lands. Others see it as metaphorical, an explanation for volcanic emergence. Either way, the stories anchored people to purpose. Voyaging wasn't reckless wandering. It was reenacting cosmic history. You breathe out, feeling the myth settle into your bones. The stars above no longer seem indifferent. They pulse with the presence of ancestral figures, each light a reminder that your voyage is part of something eternal. You're not just crossing water. You're walking in the wake of gods, following hooks that once reshaped the world. And in that thought, you feel less alone, carried not only by waves, but by stories that made the impossible feel inevitable. The canoe glides forward, and suddenly your mind fills with the image of Hawaii. Its green cliffs rising like giant teeth from the sea, waterfalls spilling down into mist, and black lava fields still warm from the Earth's furnace. You imagine what it must have been like for the very first Polynesian voyagers to set eyes on those shores, paddles dipping silently as hearts hammered with disbelief. After weeks of open water, the sight of such immense islands must have felt like stumbling into a dream. A mainstream fact. Archaeological evidence suggests that Hawaii was settled around 1,000 to 1,200 years ago by Polynesians arriving from the Marquesas Islands and later reinforced by migrants from Tahiti. These settlers carried plants, animals, and their intricate cultural systems across thousands of miles of ocean. Hawaii then developed into one of the most isolated yet vibrant civilizations in the world, proving the effectiveness of Polynesian voyaging. The quirky tidbit? Oral traditions describe canoes so loaded with breadfruit, pigs, and chickens that they resemble floating farms. Imagine being on that voyage, tripping over a chicken while trying to steer, or being woken by a pig snorting in your ear at dawn. It's chaotic, but explains how entire ecosystems were transplanted to new lands. Hawaii wasn't just settled by people. It was settled by a traveling arc of life. Historians still argue whether those first arrivals were deliberate expeditions aimed at new homelands or the result of accidental drift voyages. Was Hawaii settled by choice or by chance? The debate continues, fueled by oral histories that describe both planned exploration and miraculous landfall. Scholars lean toward deliberate settlement, given the scale of preparation required to thrive once they arrived. The sensory world sharpens as you picture that first landfall. The smell of damp vegetation rushes across the water, overpowering the flat salt of the sea. Birds wheel in the air, screeching with a noise so loud it drowns the paddles. You see firelight flickering on the shore, whether from volcanoes or from lightning igniting dry grass. And you hear the relieved laughter of sailors who, after weeks of staring at nothing but water, finally touch soil firm enough to carry their weight. A joke drifts in. You can almost hear one sailor muttering, "Great, but do they have Wi-Fi?" If only he knew the closest thing to Wi-Fi here would be the sudden chorus of cicadas sinking in perfect rhythm at sunset. As the voyagers step ashore, they begin the slow process of transforming new land into home. They plant taro and sweet potatoes, tether pigs, release chickens, and build shelters from palm fronds. They chant thanks to gods and ancestors, recognizing that this moment, this claiming of a distant shore, was both miracle and proof of their own mastery. Another scholarly debate lingers. Did Hawaii's settlement occur in waves, with return trips bringing more people, or in one decisive migration? Genetic and linguistic evidence suggests both possibilities, leaving the story open-ended. What's certain is that the islands didn't remain untouched for long. They flourished with human life, gardens, and cultural traditions carried across 1,000 leagues of restless water. You exhale slowly, imagining the soft give of volcanic soil under your bare feet, the rustle of palm leaves, and the salty sweet tang of roasted breadfruit. For the voyagers, this was a moment of reward. Proof that the stars, swells, and scents they trusted had led them to a paradise hidden in the middle of the world's largest ocean. For you, drifting in thought tonight, it's a reminder that even the most impossible journeys end in landfall, solid and real beneath your toes. You close your eyes and let the canoe sway, not just with waves but with memory. Polynesian navigators spoke often of currents of memory, the way knowledge flowed like water from teacher to apprentice, one generation to the next. It wasn't written in books, but etched into bodies. The way your skin tingled when swells shifted, the way your ears picked up a rhythm of waves in the dark, the way your eyes memorized stars until they danced in your dreams. A mainstream fact. Navigators committed vast amount of information to memory, creating internal maps that combine astronomy, oceanography, and biology. They memorized hundreds of stars and their rising points, the patterns of swells across the Pacific, and seasonal changes in wind. This memory was not static. It lived in chants, stories, and rituals, making it dynamic, flexible, and adaptable to each voyage. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some apprentices reportedly trained by floating in the shallow for hours, eyes closed, letting the swells write themselves into their muscles. They'd emerge sunburned and pruny, but with bodies that knew currents better than their minds did. Imagine explaining to your modern teacher that your homework assignment was lying in the water until I felt smarter. You'd either get detention or applause. Historians still argue whether this embodied memory system can be reconstructed today. Some say much was lost after colonial contact and suppression of traditional practices. Others point to living knowledge keepers, like Micronesian master navigator Maupelug, who proved the method still worked by guiding the canoe Hakulei across the Pacific in the 1970s without instruments. The debate itself shows how fragile and resilient memory can be at the same time. You imagine yourself as one of those apprentices, repeating a star chant until your tongue trips, again and again, until the words no longer feel separate from your breath. You hum it under your breath now, nonsense syllables standing in for the real verses, but the rhythm alone makes you feel like knowledge is sinking deeper than thought. The sensory details sharpen. You smell the faint oil of coconut rubbed on skin to protect against sun, hear the rustle of pandanus mats as someone shifts nearby, taste the salt dried on your lips. Each sense is a breadcrumb in your own trail of memory, tiny anchors holding you in place as the ocean threatens to wash you away. A joke slides in. Imagine if modern students studied this way. No flashcards, no apps, just lie on the floor sniffing the air, humming star names, and announcing, "Don't worry, I'm downloading knowledge directly into my spine." Oddly enough, it might actually work better than cramming at 3 a.m., but memory wasn't just personal, it was collective. Chants were sung aloud, stories retold at firesides, apprentices tested in groups. The memory was a river that carried everyone, and no one person was ever entirely cut off. If you forgot, someone else remembered. If you faltered, another voice filled in the gap. Another scholarly debate ripples through. Did oral memory create more accuracy than written records, or less? Skeptics say details inevitably shifted over time. Advocates argue the communal reinforcement kept knowledge sharper than a book gathering dust. The truth probably lies in the same place as the ocean, always moving, always adjusting, yet always there. You breathe deeply and let your own memory drift. The canoe rocks under you, stars wink overhead, and your body sways in time. You realize the real map was never a stick chart or a carved line. It was people themselves carrying an ocean inside their bones. And as you rock gently now, you feel a fragment of that memory pass into you too, carried on waves of thought that stretch as far as the Pacific itself. You picture the moment centuries ago when European ships finally crossed paths with Polynesian canoes. The scene is almost comical. Sailors armed with brass compasses, sextants, and charts stare at islanders who steer with no visible instruments at all. Confusion flickers across their faces. How could these toolless voyagers possibly cross such vast oceans? The Europeans, surrounded by gadgets, could barely believe what they were seeing. A mainstream fact. Early European explorers like Captain James Cook were astonished by Polynesian navigation. Cook himself relied on a Tahitian navigator, Tapaya, to guide his ship through island groups he could not have reached alone. Tapaya's knowledge of stars and currents mapped out hundreds of islands in his head, far beyond a comprehension of European charts at the time. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some European observers assumed Polynesians simply drifted aimlessly and happened to land on islands. They couldn't fathom the precision involved. Imagine having the skill to cross thousands of miles and then being told by outsiders, "Oh, so you just got lucky?" It's like running a marathon blindfolded and being accused of tripping across the finish line by chance. Historians still argue whether these encounters helped preserve navigation knowledge or accelerated its decline. On one hand, European curiosity documented some of the methods. On the other, colonial influence often dismissed or suppressed indigenous knowledge, leading to its near extinction in many regions. The irony hangs heavy. The very skills that awed outsiders were also the ones most quickly undermined by their arrival. You lean against the hull and imagine the scene. A massive wooden ship looms, sails flapping, ropes groaning. On its deck, men scribble furiously in journals, try and sketch stick charts they don't fully understand. In the smaller canoe, a Polynesian navigator simply lifts his chin to the stars, confident, unimpressed, already holding the map within his chest. The sensory details burn alive. The stink of tar and rope from the European vessel, the sharper scent of pandanus mats and salted fish from a canoe. The shouts of sailors and thick accents clash with the soft chants of islanders. Two worlds collide, both certain of their own methods, neither fully able to grasp the others. A joke sneaks in. Imagine a navigator leaning over politely and saying, "So, you guys carry around metal tools to tell you where north is?" Cute. You can almost hear the offended coughs of men polishing their sextants. But beneath the humor lies something heavier. This was a meeting of different ways of knowing. The written and the oral, the mechanical and the embodied. One depended on instruments, the other depended on human senses honed to razor sharpness. Neither was inherently superior, but history favored the side with cannons and paper. Another scholarly debate continues today. Did Polynesian navigation influence European science at all, or was it dismissed entirely until its revival centuries later? Some argue Cook and others quietly integrated observations into their own methods. Others claim the knowledge was ignored, seen as primitive. The silence in many records suggests erasure more than respect. You sigh, feeling the weight of that moment. The canoe still rocks. Stars still gleam overhead, but now you sense the faint shadow of history pressing down. Knowledge that once commanded oceans was nearly lost to skepticism. Yet here you are, whispering it back into memory, refusing to let silence win. The instruments may have been ignored, but the ocean never forgot, and tonight, neither do you. The canoe cuts across a calm stretch of sea, and in your mind you trace not just one route, but several. Different canoes, different crews, setting off at different times, sometimes toward the same destination, sometimes toward entirely separate horizons. You realize the Pacific was not a single highway, but a tangle of rival routes, overlapping and diverging like invisible threads pulled taut across the water. A mainstream fact. There is still debate among scholars about the sequence of Polynesian settlement. whether islands such as Rapa Nui, Hawaii, and Aotearoa were connected directly or through intermediate waypoints. Some argue Hawaii was first reached from the Marquesas, others from Tahiti. Likewise, theories about Rapa Nui's settlement range from a one-off voyage to multiple waves. The web of routes remains contested, a puzzle pieced together through archaeology, linguistics, and oral tradition. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some oral histories claim voyagers deliberately avoided certain routes, fearing mythical sea monsters or curse waters. Whether literal or metaphorical, these warnings shaped navigation choices. Imagine being told, yes, that way is shorter, but you'll get eaten by a giant clam, and deciding reasonably to take the long way around. Historians still argue over whether competing routes represented political rivalries. Did different island groups claim unique pathways to assert dominance, or were the variations simply pragmatic, whichever current or wind suited best? The arguments echo today like ghostly voices across the ocean, scholars debating in classrooms while waves keep rolling as they always have. You lean on the side of a canoe and picture two voyages leaving at once, canoes angled in slightly different directions. One follows a chain of stars rising in the northeast. The other pursues the setting line of Orion in the west. Weeks later, both arrive at islands, but at different coasts, their descendants claiming different stories of first landing. Suddenly you understand how rivalry and pride could shape the very memory of exploration. The sensory details press in. The hiss of water against twin hulls, the sweet-sour smell of fermenting breadfruit stored in baskets, the rasp of rope tightening under a sailor's callous hand. These are the constants, no matter which route is chosen. The differences live in stories, in chants, in whispered boasts around firesides long after voyages ended. A joke sneaks in. You imagine two navigators bumping into each other at an island, each insisting, "We got here first." It's the ancient version of arguing over who called shotgun for the front seat. But beneath the humor is a recognition of how fluid memory can be. The Pacific didn't hand out trophies for first arrival. It simply absorbed canoes, welcoming each with waves and wind. The debates belong to people, not the sea. And people, being people, sometimes care more about bragging rights than accuracy. Another scholarly debate rises here. Was Polynesia settled in deliberate expansion waves radiating outward, or through a series of overlapping back-and-forth migrations? Evidence of shared crops, tools, and even DNA suggests constant movement, not one-way colonization. The Pacific may not have been conquered in a line, but woven like a net, strands looping back and forth across centuries. You sit quietly, letting the image settle. The ocean as a vast loom, canoes as shuttles, weaving routes into a tapestry. Rival paths, rival stories, rival claims, all threads in the same cloth. And as you rock gently now, you realize it doesn't matter which route was first. What matters is that all found a way, guided by stars, swells, and the unyielding determination to keep moving forward. The canoe glides into warmer seas, and you notice how the air thickens. Humid, heavy, laced with scents that feel new. For the Polynesians, the tropics weren't just a home. They were a garden stretched across thousands of islands connected by ocean highways. But then you imagine the canoe sailing farther south, where the air sharpens and the nights bite with cold. That is where voyagers first set foot in Aotearoa, what we now call New Zealand, and everything changed. A mainstream fact. Polynesian settlers reached Aotearoa around the 13th century, making it the last major landmass on Earth to be settled by humans. The climate there was drastically different from the tropics. Cooler, with harsher winters, and plants that didn't always grow the way they did back home. The navigators had to adapt not just their voyaging, but their entire way of life, reshaping agriculture, housing, and even clothing. Here's the quirky tidbit. Oral histories say some early settlers mistook the local flightless birds, like the moa, for giant geese. The birds were taller than most humans, and weighed as much as small cows. Imagine a sailor stumbling ashore, rubbing his eyes and muttering, "Well, that's the biggest chicken I've ever seen." Sadly, moa didn't survive long after humans arrived, but they live on in those first startled stories. Historians still argue whether the settlement of Aotearoa was deliberate, targeting a known southern land, or accidental, the result of storm-driven voyages. The preparation required for survival suggests planning, but the sheer distance and difference in climate leave questions unanswered. Did navigators know what they were heading into, or did they simply trust the stars and hope for the best? The sensory world sharpens. You feel the crisp bite of southern air, hear the crash of colder surf against volcanic cliffs, smell the resin of unfamiliar forests rising in the mist. The canoe rocks heavier here, waves steeper, the water darker. You shiver just imagining paddling into those latitudes, breath clouding in the air, taro roots freezing in the ground. A joke slides in. You can almost hear one voyager grumble, "We sail for weeks, and what do we get? No coconuts. 0 out of 5 stars. Would not recommend." But complaints aside, they stayed, and they thrived, turning challenges into new culture. The adaptation was immense. Crops like breadfruit and coconuts failed, so settlers shifted to root vegetables that could survive the chill. They hunted moa for food and feathers, and they built houses with thicker walls to keep out the cold. The canoes that brought them became models for new styles of carving, and oral traditions reshaped themselves to fit new stars visible in the southern skies. Another scholarly debate rises. Did multiple waves of migration bring different groups into Aotearoa, or was it one large founding voyage? Archaeology points to multiple arrivals, but the oral histories sometimes collapse them into a single heroic story. The truth, as always, is layered, part memory, part myth, part mystery. You let the image linger. The canoe rocking in colder seas, the stars sharper overhead, the forests whispering new names to settlers who had never felt frost on their skin before. And you realize that Polynesian navigation wasn't just about finding islands. It was about transforming once you got there. The voyage never really ended. It just shifted from water to land, from paddles to gardens, from charts of swells to charts of seasons. The canoe rocks gently, and your mind drifts farther east, past the familiar chains of Tahiti and the Marquesas, past the lonely horizons where stars feel sharper than silence. There lies Rapa Nui, Easter Island, one of the most isolated dots in the Pacific, famous now for its stone giants, but once reached only by trusting waves and skies. You picture the first canoes arriving, hulls creaking after weeks of endless water, and the stunned relief of sailors spotting volcanic cliffs rising from nowhere. A mainstream fact. Rapa Nui was settled by Polynesians around 800 to 1,200 CE, making it one of the farthest outposts of their vast voyaging network. Despite its remoteness, over 2,000 kilometers from the nearest inhabited island, navigators carried plants, animals, and traditions there, proving their skill in reaching even the most distant specks of land in the Pacific. The quirky tidbit? Some oral stories suggest the first settlers were led by a chief named Hotamate, who supposedly dreamed the island before setting sail. Dreams as navigation plans. Imagine your boss announcing, "We're relocating the company because I had a very vivid nap." You'd laugh. But here, the dream matched reality and a new community was born. Historians still argue about how often contact with other islands continued after settlement. Some believe Rapa Nui was largely isolated after its founding, while others suggest occasional voyages linked it to broader Polynesian networks. The debate is fueled by fragments, tools that resemble those from elsewhere, genetic traces, and hints in oral lore. The Pacific keeps its secrets, and Rapa Nui is one of its most enigmatic. The sensory details press in. You smell the sharp tang of volcanic rock heating in the sun, hear the crash of relentless surf against cliffs, and see the eerie silhouettes of Moai statues, giant stone faces watching the horizon, as if guarding the memory of those first voyages. The statues came centuries later, but their gaze feels tied to navigators who once arrived by reading only stars and swells. A joke drifts into your thoughts. Imagine those first sailors spotting the empty island and sighing, "Finally land," only to realize it had no coconuts, no breadfruit, and very little fresh water. The Yelp review would have been brutal. Nice views, but needs more snacks. Still, they stayed. They built a society from scarce resources, carving stone from quarries, planting sweet potatoes, raising chickens. The fact that anyone survived there at all is a testament to the voyaging skill that brought them. Even isolation could not erase their connection to the wider Polynesian story. Another scholarly debate hums beneath the surface. Did voyagers from Rapa Nui ever push farther, possibly reaching South America? Some evidence hints at Polynesian-style chicken bones in Chile, or sweet potatoes traveling in the opposite direction. Was it drift, deliberate contact, or coincidence? Historians still circle the question, much like the waves circling Rapa Nui's shores. You lean back, letting the image linger. A canoe, battered but unbroken, arriving on the most remote speck of land imaginable. The sailors stumble ashore, kiss the ground, and chant thanks to ancestors. They cannot know that centuries later, the world will marvel at the stone figures their descendants carve. But in this moment, all that matters is survival, and the stars that carry them here. The canoe glides on, and you begin to notice not just goods being carried across the sea, but songs, words, and gestures, little fragments of culture hopping from island to island like sparks jumping from one fire to another. Voyages weren't just about survival or settlement. They were also about exchange. Every landfall brought something new, a trade that was as much about identity as it was about goods. A mainstream fact. Polynesian voyagers exchanged materials such as obsidian, basalt adzes, feathers, shell ornaments, and finely woven mats across wide networks. These items weren't just practical. They held ceremonial value, strengthening bonds between distant communities. Archaeological finds prove that stone tools from one island often turn up thousands of miles away, evidence of thriving trade routes across vast ocean spaces. Here's the quirky tidbit. Red feather cloaks were so prized in Hawaii and Tahiti that entire expeditions were mounted just to gather the feathers, plucking a few at a time from rare birds without killing them. Imagine the patience, months of carefully catching birds, giving them a light haircut and letting them go. It's the ultimate sustainable fashion, though you'd probably get pecked in the process. Historians still argue whether these exchanges were primarily economic or symbolic. Did voyagers sail out with trade as their main goal, or were these exchanges side effects of cultural mingling during migrations and rituals? Some evidence suggests prestige was a true currency. Owning exotic items from distant islands marked chiefs as powerful. Others argue the trade carried practical weight, supplementing scarce local resources. The sensory details sharpen. You hear the clatter of shells strung into necklaces, the soft rustle of mats folded for transport, the gleam of polished adzes catching sunlight. The canoe feels fuller now, not just with provisions, but with treasures destined for ceremonies, alliances, and the awe of future generations. You smell the faint musk of feathers packed into bundles, the earthy tang of stone fresh from quarries, the faint sweetness of dried fruit meant as gifts. A light joke slips in. You can almost hear a sailor sighing. We crossed 500 miles of open ocean just so the chief can have a shinier necklace? But then again, shiny things have motivated human travel since forever. No surprise the Pacific was no different. Exchange wasn't limited to objects. Songs, myths, and dances spread too, transforming slightly with each island stop. A chant sung in Samoa might echo in altered form in Aotearoa centuries later, carrying the same rhythm but new words. Cultures didn't just survive voyages. They grew, braided together by these invisible threads of exchange. Another scholarly debate rises. How much of Polynesian expansion was driven by the search for resources versus the desire for prestige and alliance? Some argue survival needs pushed voyagers outward, while others suggest it was pursuit of status goods, like feathers and rare stones, that inspired long journeys. The truth, as always, seems to be a mix of hunger and ambition. You let the thoughts settle as a canoe rocks beneath you. Trade, tribute, exchange, whatever you call it, the ocean wasn't a barrier. It was a bridge, carrying not just people but ideas, art, and memory. Every island was a bead, and voyages strung them together into a necklace that glittered across the Pacific. The canoe slides forward under a sky thick with stars, and your thoughts wandered how voyagers marked time itself. Out here, no calendars hung on walls, no clocks ticked on wrists. Instead, the rhythms of travel were guided by cycles of seasons, winds, and festivals, all woven into memory like another map. You realize that for Polynesians, time wasn't separate from navigation. It was navigation, a mainstream fact. Many Polynesian societies use lunar calendars, dividing the year into nights rather than days. Each night of the moon had a name, often linked with fishing, planting, or sailing conditions. Navigators knew which moons brought steady trade winds and which signaled stormy seasons, timing voyages to match the safest or most favorable periods. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some traditions, unlucky nights were named for bad omens like Night of Falling Spears or Night of Restless Ancestors. You can imagine a sailor looking at the moon chart and muttering, "Nope, not leaving on the Night of Falling Spears. Thanks." It sounds superstitious, but was a practical way of avoiding risk when conditions were historically unfavorable. Historians still argue how synchronized these calendars were across different islands. Were they broadly similar, or did each community create its own? Some suggest a shared framework stretched across the Polynesian triangle, while others believe calendars were local, tied to the unique winds and tides of each island. The truth is probably both. Shared roots adapted into local branches. You tilt your head back, imagining how voyagers read time in the sky. The rising of the Pleiades marked the start of a new year in many places, a celestial cue for planting and voyaging. The sight of certain stars at dawn or dusk reminded navigators of where they should be in the cycle of winds. Even birds and fish played a part. Migratory arrivals hinted at shifting seasons. The sensory details deepen. You hear the scrape of gourds being opened to mark the passing nights. Smell the faint smoke of a fire smoldering on shore as people chant the names of each moon phase. Feel the cool hush of pre-dawn, air thick with anticipation. Each sensation is part of clock, a reminder that time isn't mechanical, it's elemental. A light joke drifts through. Imagine telling your boss today, "Sorry, I can't work tomorrow. It's the Night of Restless Ancestors." You'd probably get fired, but out here, you'd just be showing common sense. The cyclical sense of time also made voyages less linear. You didn't just count days on the water. You marked shifts in swells, the return of familiar wind, the reappearance of a bird at dawn. Time wasn't about numbers. It was about patterns, and the navigator's job was to notice when those patterns broke. Another scholarly debate arises. Did Polynesian navigators measure time primarily in nights, swells, or star risings? Some argue the lunar cycle was dominant. Others say star observations mattered more. Perhaps the answer is that all three work together, overlapping like strands in a woven mat. You sigh softly, letting your body sway with the canoe. Out here, time feels slower, less urgent. The stars rise, the moon tilts, the waves pulse, and each repetition reassures you that you're moving, even when land is unseen. And for just a moment, you envy the simplicity of a world where time was not a buzzing alarm, but the quiet certainty of nature repeating itself. The canoe rocks lazily beneath a canopy of stars, and you think of the voyagers not just as sailors, but as musicians. Every part of their journey had a rhythm. Paddles rising and falling, chants echoing across the water, waves tapping the hull in steady percussion. Navigation wasn't only about sight or touch. It was also about sound. The Pacific itself sang, and navigators learned to listen. A mainstream fact. Chants and songs were crucial to wayfinding, both for memorization and for keeping paddlers in unison. Certain chants encoded star paths, while others recounted genealogies, tying voyages to ancestral memory. Rhythm kept the crew's strokes even, preventing exhaustion and ensuring the canoe cut smoothly through swells. In this sense, music wasn't just cultural. It was practical. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some traditions, navigators tapped on a hull with sticks or clapped softly to demonstrate the rhythm of wave patterns to apprentices. It was like an impromptu drum lesson at sea. Imagine your sailing instructor pausing mid-lecture to start a percussion jam session, insisting, "No, listen, this is what a northern swell sounds like." You'd laugh, but the beat would stay in your bones long after. Historians still argue whether these chants were rigidly memorized or allowed to flex with improvisation. Were they sacred scripts that had to be sung word for word, or were they more like jazz standards, adaptable, so long as the core message survived? The lack of written scores leaves the question open, but the survival of melodies across generations suggests flexibility was part of the design. The sensory details deepen. You hear the low hum of voices blending with the sigh of wind and sails, the slap of paddles hitting water in perfect unison, the hollow thump of feet shifting on wooden planks. The smell of sweat mingles with the brine of sea spray. Each breath draws you deeper into the collective pulse of the canoe. A light joke slips in. You can almost picture a sailor groaning, "Great, another 200 miles of the same verse stuck in my head." The world's longest road trip playlist, except you can't change the channel. Your survival depends on singing along. Music also bound the crew together emotionally. In moments of fear, chants steadied nerves. In moments of triumph, they celebrated survival. When the horizon offered nothing but sameness, songs reminded voyagers that they carried their homeland inside their voices. Even if land was weeks away, home lived in the sound of familiar melodies. Another scholarly debate arises. Did navigators use pitch and tone to replicate environmental cues, or were chants strictly verbal mnemonics? Some argue the chants mirrored the rising and falling of swells or the pacing of paddles, creating a sensory echo of the environment. Others dismiss this as speculation. Either way, the blending of sound and survival reveals a truth. The Pacific was navigated as much with ears as with eyes. You lean back, letting an imaginary chant hum low in your throat. The words are nonsense, but the rhythm carries you, steady, repetitive, soothing. The canoe rocks, your body sways, and suddenly you feel part of the chorus, another voice keeping time with stars and waves. Out here, the ocean isn't silent. It hums, it drums, it sings, and if you're listening closely enough, you can almost hear it guiding you home. The canoe drifts onward, and you imagine the ceremonies that unfolded before such a voyage ever began. No one simply climbed aboard and shoved off. Departure was sacred, a crossing from one world into another, and it demanded blessings. On shore, families gathered, priests chanted, and offerings were made to the sea. You see it now. Torches flickering, drums echoing, and a hush falling as the navigator steps forward, ready to lead. A mainstream fact. Polynesian voyagers often conducted elaborate rituals before embarking, invoking gods of the sea, sky, and wind. Priests sprinkled water, chanted protective prayers, and sometimes offered food or kava root to ensure safe passage. These rituals were not optional. They anchored the journey in divine approval, reminding everyone that they sail with more than just skill. They sail with spiritual backing. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some accounts, pigs or chickens were brought to the shore, not to be eaten, but to be shown the canoe, literally introduced to the vessel, before being loaded. It was as if the animals needed to be spiritually briefed. This is your new home. Don't panic. You grin at the thought of a priest solemnly presenting a canoe to a slightly confused pig. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were uniform across Polynesia or varied dramatically by island. Did Tahitians follow the same rites as Hawaiians? Were some voyages more ritual-heavy, while others were pragmatic? The absence of written records leaves the answer uncertain, though archaeological and oral evidence both suggest wide diversity with shared core of respect for the ocean. The sensory world sharpens. You smell the sharp sweetness of burning ti leaves, hear the low drone of conch shells blown across the shoreline, and feel the vibration of feet stomping in rhythm on packed sand. The night air carries tension, fear and excitement woven together, until the final blessing is spoken and the crew steps into the canoe with renewed courage. A joke sneaks in. Imagine having to tell your friends today, "Sorry I can't leave yet. My priest hasn't shown my card to the chickens." The absurdity makes you chuckle. But for voyagers, it wasn't absurd at all. Every detail mattered when you put your life in the hands of stars and swells. The rituals also served social functions. They reminded the community that voyaging wasn't an individual stunt, but a collective endeavor. Families and villages invested hope, resources, and blessings into the crew. The navigator carried not just tools of memory, but the weight of prayers spoken by hundreds of voices. Another scholarly debate lingers. Were these ceremonies primarily religious, or did they also function as psychological preparation? Did the chants calm nerves and reinforce trust, much like modern pre-flight safety briefings? Some anthropologists argue exactly that. The ritual worked because it aligned minds as much as it invoked gods. You let the image linger. A torchlit shore, chants rising, the ocean sighing in the dark. When the canoe finally pushes into the waves, it doesn't feel like wood and rope. It feels like a consecrated vessel, carrying a village's breath, a people's faith, and a navigator's vow. Out here, Every voyage begins not with paddles but with prayers, whispered into the waiting sea. The canoe glides into another night, and your thoughts shift to what voyagers believed about the sea itself. To them, the ocean was not empty. It was alive, inhabited by gods, spirits, and ancestors who watched every stroke of the paddle. You feel it too, that presence under the waves, as though the water itself listens to your breath. A mainstream fact. Polynesian cosmologies often frame the ocean as both pathway and deity. Tangaroa, the god of the sea, was worshipped widely, with prayers offered before voyages. Ancestors were also believed to guide canoes, their spirits living among the stars or in the winds. Voyaging was never just practical. It was an act of communion with forces beyond the visible world. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some traditions, navigators were said to communicate with sharks, dolphins, or birds as messengers of the gods. Imagine leaning over the hull and politely asking a shark for directions, absurd to modern ears, but deeply meaningful in context. You chuckle, picturing a dolphin popping up as a kind of ancient Siri. In 2 miles, turn left at the atoll. Historians still argue how literally these beliefs were held. Were they metaphors, teaching respect for nature, or were they taken as direct truths, lived realities of voyagers? The answer is blurred. Myth and science coexisted. A sailor could trust both a star compass and a whispered prayer to Tangaroa, without contradiction. The sensory details thicken. You hear the hush of waves curling against the hull like a low chant. You smell the tang of salt mingled with smoke from a small lamp still burning on deck. You feel the uncanny stillness between swells, as if the sea itself pauses to watch. The night becomes cathedral-like, the stars lanterns, the water an altar. A light joke slips in. Imagine the crew arguing whether a bird circling the canoe is just hungry or actually grandma checking in. Either way, you'd probably toss it some fish scraps, just in case. Spirituality also shaped discipline. The navigator wasn't just a leader, but often acted as priest, binding the crew to share belief. Fear of angering sea gods helped enforce rules. No careless waste, no arrogance, no disrespect of forces that kept them alive. The voyage wasn't just survival. It was ritual lived day after day. Another scholarly debate emerges. Did Polynesian spirituality drive exploration, framing new islands as gifts from gods? Or did myths develop later to explain the fact of expansion? Some argue voyages were pragmatic, with ritual layered on afterward. Others believe cosmology inspired daring, giving divine justification for risk. Both views may be true, braided together like the lashings of a canoe. You lean back now, letting the ocean rock you, and the stars feel closer than ever. The sea hums, the wind sighs, and for a fleeting moment, you believe what they once believed, that the ocean is listening, that ancestors guide you, that the water itself is a living companion. It's not emptiness, it's presence. And tonight, you float within it, carried like a prayer whispered into eternity. The canoe drifts beneath a sky that looks familiar, yet strangely shifted. New constellations rise, unfamiliar to eyes trained in the tropics. You imagine being a voyager sailing farther south than ever before, staring at stars you've never seen, and realizing your old compass has holes in it. What do you do when the heavens themselves change? You adapt, a mainstream fact. As Polynesians pushed into the far reaches of the Pacific, like Aotearoa, New Zealand, they encountered southern constellations unseen in their ancestral homelands. They adapted their star compasses, integrating new stars into their chants and navigation systems. Some navigators relied on the Southern Cross to help orient themselves, particularly to mark due south. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some traditions describe the Southern Cross not just as a directional marker, but as a giant stingray, its body spread across the night sky. Imagine using a cosmic stingray as your road sign. Just follow the tail to find south. It's both terrifying and delightful, depending on how you feel about stingrays. Historians still argue whether voyagers immediately understood these new stars, or whether trial and error slowly integrated them into charts. Did the first crew stumble south by instinct and return to teach, or did they deliberately set out to study? The lack of records leaves scholars guessing, though the oral tradition suggests both deliberate adaptation and slow experimentation. The sensory details sharpen. You picture the chill of the southern wind cutting sharper than tropical breezes, the hiss of colder waves, and the awe of seeing the Southern Cross blaze above dark cliffs. The stars look sharper in that air, and the navigator's chants sound heavier, weighted with the strangeness of learning a new sky. A light joke drifts in. You can almost hear a young apprentice groan, "Great, more stars to memorize," as if 300 weren't enough already. It's the ancient version of complaining about homework, except the penalty for failure wasn't attention. It was starvation at sea. Yet the adaptation reveals something profound. Polynesian navigation wasn't rigid. It was a living system, able to absorb new knowledge, expand, and evolve. The cosmos itself became a classroom, each new voyage adding more lessons to the star compass. Another scholarly debate circles here. Did this flexibility make Polynesian navigation unique compared to other maritime traditions? Some argue yes, because it relied less on fixed instruments and more on living observation, making it inherently adaptable. Others caution against romanticizing, pointing out that all seafaring cultures adapted to local skies. Still, few match the scale of Polynesian voyages. You tilt your head upward, tracing the Southern Cross in your imagination. For stars, sharp and insistent, standing like a signpost in the night. For those first voyagers, it was both strange and reassuring. Proof that even when the sky shifted, the ocean still gave you tools to find your way. And for you, rocking gently tonight, it's a reminder that change doesn't erase knowledge. It expands it star by star. The canoe creaks as dawn breaks, the horizon painted in soft pinks and oranges. You picture not just a crew, but their children watching with wide eyes, absorbing everything long before they're formally taught. Navigation wasn't learned from a book. It was lived from birth. Every child born into a voyaging culture inherited the ocean as both playground and classroom. A mainstream fact. Polynesian knowledge was preserved through oral tradition, ritual, and apprenticeship. Children grew up hearing star chants, watching ceremonies, and joining shorter journeys before advancing to long voyages. Memory was safeguarded by constant repetition, with each generation tested to ensure knowledge didn't fade. In this way, centuries of expertise survived without writing. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some island groups use riddles or playful challenges to test young apprentices. Elders might ask, which star rises when the breadfruit ripens? Or, which bird tells you the way home? A child answering correctly will be praised. Answering wrong might earn a teasing laugh. Imagine your geography teacher turning class into a game show. For 10 coconuts, can you name this constellation? Historians still argue whether this preservation system was more vulnerable to loss than written records. Did oral memory risk distortion? Or did communal correction keep it sharper? Some point to the survival of detailed chants across centuries as proof of remarkable resilience. Others note that colonial suppression disrupted the chain, leading to gaps we can't fully fill today. The sensory details come alive. You hear the laughter of children chasing each other across sand. Smell the smoke of fish roasting, while elders chant verses. Feel the tug of small hands on rope as apprentices mimic adults tightening sails. Knowledge wasn't locked in dusty scrolls. It was everywhere, woven into the rhythm of daily life. A joke surfaces. Imagine a child today explaining to their parent, "Don't worry, I know how to get home. I memorized the swell pattern near Grandma's house." You'd either be impressed or slightly concerned. Preserving navigation also meant guarding it. Some chants were secret, reserved for chosen apprentices, while others were sung publicly at ceremonies. The secrecy protected knowledge from being diluted, but also meant some traditions vanished when teachers were lost. That fragility makes the surviving chants all the more precious. Another scholarly debate. Were there schools of navigation with formal structures, or was training always informal, passed within families? Some traditions describe sacred houses of learning, where apprentices stayed for months. Others insist learning was less rigid, shaped by the sea itself. The arguments ripple on, unresolved. You lean back and let the canoe sway lull you. You imagine a child beside you, repeating a star name you whispered 100 times, their voice small but steady. That child will one day guide a canoe across the Pacific, carrying not just memory but continuity. And in that realization, you understand navigation wasn't just about finding islands. It was about ensuring a culture never drifted away, no matter how wide the ocean spread. The canoe sways gently, and you think of names whispered with reverence. Navigators remembered not for their chance alone, but for the lives they saved, the routes they revealed. They are the masters, their memory preserved like guiding stars. In some places their names are carved into oral genealogies, each one a marker of knowledge passed faithfully down the line. A mainstream fact. Polynesian tradition often preserved the legacies of great navigators in chants and stories, linking them to chiefs and ancestors. Their expertise became part of collective memory, ensuring that future generations didn't just recall the routes, but the people who made them possible. The navigator was both scientist and cultural hero, immortalized through repetition. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some navigators were said to possess supernatural sight, able to see islands days before they appeared on the horizon. You can almost picture a sailor squinting into empty water and saying, "There, land," while everyone else sees nothing. 2 days later, land emerges exactly where he pointed. If nothing else, it must have been a great way to win arguments. Historians still argue whether such stories were metaphorical, symbolizing keen perception of clouds, birds, and swells, or literal belief in mystical powers. Did these navigators truly claim vision beyond ordinary senses, or did apprentices later exaggerate their gifts to honor them? The debate continues, blurring the line between miracle and mastery. The sensory world sharpens. You hear the low hum of voices reciting a lineage of names around a fire, the soft crackle of burning wood, the salt tang in the night air. Each name feels like a stone dropped into the sea, sending ripples outward, shaping identity and memory. These were not forgotten figures. They were carried in song, alive as long as their names were spoken. A light joke slips in. Imagine if modern GPS apps were named after legendary navigators. Turn left at Maui's Hook in 500 feet. You'd laugh, but maybe you'd trust the directions more. Honoring masters wasn't just about respect. It reinforced authority. Apprentices understood they were walking in the footsteps of giants, and every voyage echoed the past. In this way, memory became discipline. A navigator's mistakes weren't just personal failures. They were blemishes on a sacred lineage. Another scholarly debate rises. How many of these remembered masters were historical individuals, and how many were symbolic archetypes? Some evidence suggests real people lived behind the legends, while others may have been composites of multiple figures. Either way, the tradition ensured their presence remained vital, shaping the culture long after their bones had returned to the sea. You let your breath slow. Imagine yourself at that fire, the chants rolling like waves. The names are strange to you, but their weight presses into your chest. You realize that voyaging wasn't about individuals alone. It was about a chain of memories stretching across centuries. Each navigator added a link, binding people together across time and tide. The canoe rocks on, and your thoughts drift not only to the past but to the present. For centuries, much of this knowledge was silenced. Colonial schools dismissed oral chants as superstition, and missionaries urged people to forget pagan ways. But memory, like the ocean, has a stubborn tide. It returns. And in the late 20th century, the old art of navigation began to rise again, reborn in modern canoes. A mainstream fact. The revival of Polynesian navigation gained momentum in the 1970s, most famously with the canoe hukli in Hawaii. Guided by Micronesian master navigator Malpielug, the canoe sailed from Hawaii to Tahiti without modern instruments, proving the ancient method still worked. The voyage reignited pride in Polynesian heritage and inspired a new generation of wayfinders. Here's the quirky tidbit. When hukli first launched in 1975, some locals doubted it could make the trip. Jokes circulated that a tugboat would have to tow it halfway. But the crew arrived triumphantly, their success silencing skeptics and sparking a cultural renaissance. You can almost hear the smirk in a navigator's voice. Told you we didn't need your compass. Historians still argue how much of ancient knowledge survived intact and how much had to be reconstructed. Did Malpielug and others pass on an unbroken lineage, or were fragments pieced together with scholarly help? The debate underscores both the fragility and resilience of oral tradition. Even if parts were lost, the spirit of the method endured, strong enough to be revived. The sensory details sharpen. You picture clear red sails billowing against the turquoise horizon, the salt spray soaking a new generation of voyagers, the crowd cheering onshore as drums thundered. You smell roasted pig from a welcoming feast, hear chants rolling across a harbor thick with emotion, feel the raw pride of people reclaiming something once nearly erased. A light joke sneaks in. Imagine explaining to the U.S. Coast Guard that you're about to sail 2,500 miles with no GPS, no compass, no sextant, just stars and swells. The reaction would probably be, good luck with that. And yet it worked. The revival also sparked broader movements. In Aotearoa, the Maori rekindled their voyaging traditions. In Tahiti, new canoes were built. Across the Pacific, islands once linked by memory found themselves reconnecting physically, their sails like red and white stitches sewing the ocean back together. Another scholarly debate continues. Should the revival be seen as a faithful continuation of ancient practice, or as a modern reinvention inspired by the past? Some argue the line doesn't matter. What matters is that the knowledge lives, breathes, and guides once more. You breathe deeply, letting the canoe beneath you feel like both ancient vessel and modern symbol. The stars above are the same ones Maupila read, the same ones his ancestors knew, the same ones Polynesian children still learn today. Knowledge doesn't vanish. It waits, like constellations behind clouds, ready to shine again when the night clears. The canoe drifts onward, but your thoughts have circled back to where they began, not to maps or chants or debates, but to the simple act of looking up at the stars. All the complexity, all the rituals, all the debates about intention or accident fade for a moment. What remains is a quiet miracle that human beings once trusted nothing more than their senses, their memory, and their faith, and managed to cross the largest ocean on Earth. A mainstream fact. Polynesian navigation stands as one of humanity's greatest achievements, on par with any invention of the ancient or modern world. Without compasses, sextants, or written charts, voyagers connected a region that spans a third of the planet, carrying plants, animals, and culture with them. This was exploration at its purest, long before European contact, proving that humans were always capable of more than skeptics assumed. Here's the quirky tidbit. Even today, modern voyagers sometimes test themselves by leaving GPS behind, challenging apprentices to sail by stars and swells alone. Inevitably, someone cracks a joke about how they're basically cosplaying as their ancestors, but the laughter doesn't erase the awe when they actually make landfall. That sense of continuity, of stepping into the shoes of the past, is itself a form of navigation. Historians still argue whether Polynesian expansion was primarily deliberate or partly accidental, whether Chan preserved precise science or poetic metaphor, whether routes were one-way or constant back and forth. But as you lean into the night, rocking with the canoe, those debates feel small compared to the undeniable truth. They did it. Islands were found, lives were carried, cultures thrived. However it happened, it worked. The sensory world closes in gently now. You smell salt dried on your skin, hear the hush of waves curling against the hull, feel the canoe rise and fall like a cradle. The stars seem lower, closer, as though they've stooped to keep you company. Your eyelids grow heavy, and the chant you once imagined echoes softly, almost like a lullaby. A joke surfaces faintly. If you were asked to guide a canoe tonight, you'd probably point at the brightest star and say, "Let's just follow that one." The crew would groan, but perhaps they'd laugh too, and maybe, just maybe, you'd stumble onto land by dawn. Stranger things have happened. Another scholarly debate flickers. Did voyaging decline because resources dwindled, or because people had already reached the edges of the map? Either way, you sense the voyagers would have understood. They knew when to push forward and when to let the sea rest. Even knowledge has tides. Your breath slows. The canoe rocks. The chants fade into the rhythm of waves. And you realize the story has carried you, too. Not across the Pacific, but across hours of thought and imagination, until you're floating in the same timeless rhythm that once guided canoes. Now the narration softens, slipping into the wind down you've been waiting for. The stars above blur into a silver mist, their light gentler now. No longer sharp points, but glowing embers scattered across velvet sky. The canoe moves almost without motion, gliding so smoothly, You can barely tell where the sea ends and the horizon begins. The night is no longer vast or intimidating. It has folded itself around you protective, like a blanket pulled close. You breathe in, and the salt air feels lighter than before, no longer biting at your lips but soft like dew. The sound slow. The waves hush into long, stretching sighs, and even the wood of the canoe seems to creak more lazily, as if it too is easing into rest. You imagine stars blinking lower and slower, their light winking like drowsy eyelids, keeping watch as you sink deeper into calm. There's no urgency here. No storms, no debates, no rival routes. Only stillness. Only the gentle certainty that the ocean has carried countless lives safely before and will carry you, too. You are adrift, yes, but in the safest possible way, rocked in the arms of sea and sky, as ancestors once were, as future generations will be. Let your breath follow the rhythm of the waves now. In and out, in and out. Each breath slower, heavier, steadier. Let your body loosen as though you too are lashed gently to the canoe, swaying but never falling. Every worry has been left on shore. Every thought that tugged at you is quieted. The last image fades into your mind. A horizon washed in the faintest light of dawn, stars dimming slowly as the sun promises to rise. You are safe. You are steady. You are carried. And the sea whispers to you now in its ancient voice, "Rest, traveler, rest."